Drink your special tea, Dad. It will help you sleep. That is what my daughter-in-law told me every single night with a smile that looked like pure devotion. For 6 months, I drank her bitter herbal blend, and for 6 months my life became a heavy, dark fog. I forgot names. I lost track of days. I thought my mind was finally failing me. But one night, a bad bout of acid reflux made me pour that tea into a potted plant. 30 minutes later, the fog in my brain vanished. The clarity was sudden and sharp. And when I listened through the floor vent, I heard a conversation so terrifying it froze the blood in my veins. The people I loved most were planning to destroy me. I am Sylvester. I am 69 years old and a retired civil engineer. Before I tell you exactly how I turned their wicked game against them, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that greed always digs its own grave. It started on a Tuesday evening. Heather handed me the ceramic mug. The dark liquid inside steamed, smelling of wet earth and something faintly metallic. "Drink it while it is hot, Dad," she insisted. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a neat ponytail, projecting the image of the perfect holistic health influencer she played on the internet. I took a sip. It was vile. My stomach churned. I had been suffering from acid reflux all week, and this liquid felt like battery acid. As soon as Heather turned her back to answer a text on her phone, I stood up. My hands were shaking. I walked over to the large bonsai tree sitting near the bay window and poured the entire mug into the damp soil. I wiped the rim quickly, sat back down, and pretended to finish the last drop. "Good night, Dad," Heather said, taking the empty mug from my hands with a smirk. "Sleep well." I went to my bedroom and lay down, expecting the usual heavy darkness to consume me. Normally, within 20 minutes of drinking that tea, a blanket of confusion would smother my thoughts. My limbs would turn to lead and I would pass out. But tonight, as I stared at the ceiling, something miraculous happened. The fog began to lift. My vision sharpened in the dark room. The persistent ringing in my ears faded away. For the first time in half a year, I felt awake. I felt like Sylvester again. The house was incredibly quiet. I sat up, flexing my fingers. They did not tremble. I stood up and walked across the floor without the shuffling stumble that had become my daily routine. If I was fine tonight, then the tea was the direct source of my misery. As a civil engineer, I built this house from the ground up. I knew its bones and its unique acoustics. I knelt quietly beside the large brass air return vent set into the baseboard. It connected directly to the main ductwork above the living room. I pressed my ear against the cool metal grating. The voices traveling up the shaft were crystal clear. It was Kendrick, my only son, and Heather. "Did you give him the full dose tonight?" Kendrick asked. His voice carried a frantic, nervous edge. "Of course I did," Heather replied. Her tone was completely different from the sweet persona she used upstairs. It was cold and dripping with contempt. The old man was barely putting 2 sentences together at dinner. "He called me by his dead wife's name yesterday. The stuff is working perfectly. We are running out of time." Kendrick paced the floor. I could hear his heavy footsteps vibrating through the vent. "Those guys from the downtown syndicate called again. They are demanding their $3 million. They threatened to visit my office. If we do not get the title to this land by the end of the month, I am a dead man." "Relax," Heather snapped. "Dr. Beaumont is coming over next week for a fake social visit. He is already on the payroll. He will observe Sylvester dropping glasses and forgetting his birthday. Beaumont will sign the official medical certificate declaring your father mentally incompetent due to advanced dementia. Once we have that declaration, the power of attorney becomes absolute. Your father is sitting on 3 acres of prime real estate right in the middle of the new commercial zoning district. The developers will pay $4 million cash just to bulldoze this ugly brick house. We pay off your stupid debts, and we take the rest. We will dump the old man in a cheap state-run nursing home and finally start living our lives." I stopped breathing. The cold brass of the vent pressed against my cheek, but the chill spreading through my chest was far worse. I designed this exact heating and cooling system 30 years ago. I spent weeks calculating the airflow, mapping out the ducts to ensure the harsh winter drafts would never reach the master bedroom. I did it because my late wife Corinne had terrible circulation. She used to shiver in the cold. I built this entire fortress of brick and steel to keep her warm, to protect our family. I worked double shifts hauling concrete and checking blueprints until my hands bled just to secure this piece of land for our future. I did it all for Corinne and for the boy she brought into this world. Now that same boy was standing in the living room I built plotting to steal my life's work to pay off his illicit gambling debts. He was conspiring with a woman who hated our history to lock me away in a sterile room until I died. My heart shattered into pieces, but my mind remained incredibly sharp. I did not scream. I did not run downstairs and demand an explanation from the son I had raised. Grief and shock threatened to paralyze me, but the analytical mind of an engineer took over. Panic is a weak response and strategy is survival. I stood up silently. I moved toward the bathroom with calculated precision. My mind was operating faster than it had in a decade. I needed physical evidence immediately. I opened my shaving kit and took out a small, clear Ziploc bag. I walked back to the bedroom window. The bonsai tree soil was still damp from the toxic tea I had poured out earlier. I used a small spoon from my nightstand to carefully scoop up the dark, saturated topsoil, securing the wet clumps into the plastic bag. I sealed it tight and tucked it deep inside my inner jacket pocket hanging in the closet. This was the irrefutable proof of my daily poisoning. Just as I closed the closet door, the sharp, rhythmic click of high heels echoed from the bottom of the staircase. Heather was coming up. I heard her voice carry up the stairwell. "I will go check on him, Kendrick. We need to make sure he is completely under before we call Beaumont to confirm the schedule." The wooden stairs creaked under her weight. She was 10 seconds away from my door. If she saw me standing here alert and completely lucid, the entire element of surprise would vanish. They would know I was aware. Desperate people do desperate things, and Kendrick was $3 million in debt to violent men. They would not wait for a doctor. They would just orchestrate a fatal accident. I threw myself onto the bed. I pulled the heavy quilt up to my chin. I tossed my right arm over the edge of the mattress, letting it hang limp and lifeless. I slowed my breathing to a deep rhythmic snore, mimicking the drug-induced stupor I had exhibited for the past 6 months. I relaxed every muscle in my face, letting my jaw hang slightly slack. The brass doorknob turned slowly. The hinges let out a soft whine. I kept my eyes shut, feeling the sudden beam of hallway light slice across my face. Heather stepped into the room. She stood right beside the bed, evaluating me. I felt the heat of her gaze scanning my face in the dark room. I let out a low, raspy groan and fluttered my eyes open, blinking against the harsh hallway light slicing across the mattress. I made my hands tremble violently as I reached out toward her silhouette. "Corinne," I mumbled, letting my voice crack with frail vulnerability. "Corinne, is that you? Did you turn off the stove down there?" Heather let out a sharp, dismissive scoff. Her shadow shifted as she crossed her arms in irritation. "It is Heather, you old fool," she whispered to herself, though she spoke loud enough for me to hear perfectly. She leaned closer, her voice suddenly dripping with fake, sugary sweetness. "Go back to sleep, Dad. Corinne is not here." I let my arm fall heavily back to the mattress, staring blankly at the ceiling. "Okay, Corinne," I mumbled, turning my head away into the pillow. "I am just so tired today." I heard the distinct sound of her smiling. It was a cold, triumphant exhalation. She turned on her heel and walked out, pulling the door shut behind her. The click of the latch was the sound of my survival. I was safe for the night. The next morning I shuffled into the kitchen, dragging my feet across the hardwood floor. Heather was busy setting up her ring light for a live stream, blending a green smoothie, while Kendrick aggressively typed on his phone. I played my part flawlessly. I asked what year it was, looking around confused. I spilled half my orange juice on the counter, letting my hand shake. Heather rolled her eyes and tossed me a dish towel without a word. I told them I was going to sit on the park bench down the street to feed the pigeons. Kendrick barely looked up from his glowing screen, just waving me off as if I were a stray dog. The moment I turned the corner out of their line of sight, my hunched posture straightened instantly. The pathetic shuffle disappeared. I walked briskly to the main avenue and hailed a taxi. I gave the driver an address on the other side of town. An independent private clinic far away from the neighborhood doctors who knew my family or might alert Kendrick. I walked through the sliding glass doors and paid cash for a premium expedited toxicology screening. I handed the nurse the Ziploc bag with the damp bonsai soil and rolled up my sleeve for the blood test. The wait felt like an absolute eternity. I sat in the sterile white waiting room watching the wall clock tick away the seconds. 2 hours later, Dr. Aris, an older physician with sharp, calculating eyes, called me into his private office. He held a manila folder tightly, and his expression was grim. "Mr. Sylvester," he began sliding a printed report across the heavy mahogany desk. "Your blood work is highly alarming. I am looking at elevated levels of thallium, a heavy metal commonly found in rat poison. Furthermore, your system is completely flooded with benzodiazepines. It is a powerful sedative often used for severe psychiatric patients to induce compliance. The soil sample you provided contains massive concentrations of the exact same toxic compounds. Someone is systematically introducing these toxins into your daily routine. This is not accidental exposure. This is a deliberate, calculated dosage designed to mimic severe cognitive decline and eventually cause fatal organ failure." I stared at the black ink on the white paper. The numbers and medical jargon quantified my ultimate betrayal. Kendrick was not just trying to drug me into a nursing home to steal my property. The presence of heavy metals meant they were slowly killing me. They wanted me dead before any legitimate medical professional could catch on to the fraud. My own son was murdering me sip by sip under my own roof. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest, but my sorrow was quickly replaced by a surging, relentless fury. I folded the lab results methodically. I now held the undeniable scientific proof of their deadly conspiracy. "Doctor." Aris picked up his desk phone. "I am legally obligated to contact law enforcement right now, Mr. Sylvester. We need to get the police involved immediately before you go back to that house." I reached across the desk and pressed my hand firmly over the receiver, pushing it down. "No police," I said, my voice low and hard. "Not yet." The doctor looked at me like I was insane. "They are trying to kill you," he insisted. "I know," I replied, securing the medical report into my inner jacket pocket. "But police mean an investigation, and an investigation means lawyers and loopholes. My son is $3 million in debt to dangerous men. The dirt under my house is located dead center in the city's new commercial mega center zoning project. Developers are offering $4 million cash just for the rights to bulldoze it. The enemy plotting my demise is calling me dad every single day. If I call the police now, he will claim ignorance. He will blame his wife or claim I poisoned myself in a fit of dementia. I will not give him that chance to escape. I am going to bury him myself." I left the clinic and flagged down another taxi. The ride back to my neighborhood was a blur of passing streets and churning calculated thoughts. The heavy metal poisoning explained the distinct metallic taste of Heather's nightly tea. The sedatives explained the thick mental fog that had stolen 6 months of my life. I had the medical proof, the indisputable paper trail of their attempted murder. But proof was only half the battle. I needed to lock down my assets before Kendrick's frantic financial desperation pushed him to do something drastic and physical. I needed to trap him completely in his own blinding greed. I paid the driver a block away from my house and walked the rest of the distance to avoid any suspicion. I unlocked the front door as quietly as possible. The house was dead silent. Heather was likely out shopping with my credit cards playing her influencer role, and Kendrick was supposed to be at his office managing his failing business ventures. But as I stepped into the main hallway, a faint metallic scraping sound echoed from the lower level. I walked toward the kitchen and noticed the heavy oak door leading to the basement was left slightly ajar. A thin sliver of yellow light spilled onto the top stair. I moved with complete silence, placing my feet strictly on the outer edges of the wooden steps where the floorboards would not creak. I descended slowly into the cool, damp air of the basement. There, at the far end of the room, illuminated by a single hanging utility bulb, was Kendrick. He was kneeling on the concrete floor, sweating profusely and breathing heavily. In his hands was a heavy steel crowbar and a set of professional lockpicks. He was violently jamming the metal tools into the brass dial of my heavy iron floor safe. The safe, where I kept the original deed to the house, my life insurance policies, and the bearer bonds I had saved for his future. Kendrick grunted in sheer frustration, throwing the crowbar violently against the concrete. "Open up, you rusty piece of junk!" he hissed, wiping the sweat from his forehead with a trembling hand. He grabbed the dial and started spinning it frantically, trying to guess the combination. He was so consumed by his mounting panic that he had no idea I was standing in the shadows just 10 feet behind him, watching my own flesh and blood try to rob me blind. I stepped out of the shadows, deliberately dragging my right foot across the cold concrete floor to announce my sudden presence. The harsh, scraping sound made Kendrick jump violently, nearly dropping the heavy steel crowbar onto his own foot. He spun around, his eyes wide with the panicked guilt of a desperate thief caught dead in the act. "What are you doing down here, Kendrick?" I asked, keeping my voice weak and intentionally slurred. "You know my knees ache terribly when it rains." "I was just looking for my winter coat." Kendrick quickly kicked his professional lockpicks under a dusty cardboard box and forced a strained, unnatural smile that did not reach his eyes. "Dad, what are you doing home?" he stammered, wiping thick black grease from his hands onto his expensive tailored slacks. "I thought you were at the park feeding the birds. I just came down here to help you out. I noticed your medical bills are piling up upstairs, so I wanted to find those old insurance papers. You know, the ones you locked away years ago for emergencies. I am just trying to get things organized for you before you forget where they are entirely." The lie was so perfectly smooth it made my stomach turn. He was actively trying to rob my life savings under the guise of being a dutiful, caring son. I let my lower lip tremble and adopted a blank, vacant stare, looking right past his shoulder. "You are such a good boy, Kendrick," I murmured, patting my thick cardigan pockets with an exaggerated display of elderly confusion. "Insurance papers. Yes, Corinne always said we needed to keep those safe. Did I lock them away?" I reached deep into my pocket and pulled out the heavy brass key to the floor safe. My hand shook violently as I held it out to him in the dim basement light. "You can open it." I cannot remember the numbers anymore. Kendrick's eyes lit up with a ravenous, uncontrollable greed. He snatched the key from my trembling fingers without a single word of thanks. He practically dove toward the heavy iron safe, inserting the key and cranking the thick metal handle with reckless force. The heavy door creaked open, revealing the dark, dusty interior. He reached in frantically, fully expecting to find the original property deed, my bearer bonds, and the lucrative life insurance policies I had built up over decades of hard labor. Instead, his greedy hands grabbed nothing but stacks of useless expired warranties, faded appliance manuals, and outdated tax returns from 20 years ago. I had removed all the vital legal documents months ago as a precaution and secured them in a hidden wall panel he did not even know existed. "What is this absolute garbage?" Kendrick hissed, tossing a handful of yellowed, useless papers onto the dirty concrete floor. "Where is the deed, Dad? Where are the actual legal documents?" I tilted my head, looking at him with an empty, bewildered expression. "The deed?" I asked, softly, playing the fool to absolute perfection. "I think I gave it to the mailman yesterday. Or maybe Corinne put it up in the attic before she passed. I am so tired, Kendrick. I think I need to lie down right now." I turned around and slowly climbed the wooden stairs, leaving him kneeling in the dirt, surrounded by a worthless paper, his frustrated curses echoing loudly through the basement walls. As soon as I reached the main floor, my frail persona vanished completely. My posture straightened and my mind raced with calculated precision. I locked my bedroom door and pulled out my encrypted burner phone. I dialed a number I knew by heart. Garrett was a ruthless financial attorney and a fiercely loyal friend I had known for 30 years. He picked up on the second ring. "Sylvester," Garrett said, his voice sharp and professional. "I was just about to call you. Things are moving much faster than we anticipated." "Garrett," I said, my voice low and steady. "Kendrick is down in the basement right now trying to crack my safe. He truly thinks I'm losing my mind. I need to know exactly what we are dealing with. How deep is my son in the financial hole?" "I ran the full comprehensive background check you requested," Sylvester, Garrett replied, the rustle of heavy paperwork clearly audible over the secure line. "It is much worse than just a few bad business deals. Your son is completely drowning. 2 years ago, he tried to play the big shot in the cryptocurrency market. He leveraged his entire logistics company, took out massive high-interest commercial loans, and poured every single cent into a digital coin that collapsed overnight. When the legitimate banks aggressively cut him off, he turned to the shadow economy to cover his margins. He currently owes exactly $3 million to a very dangerous underground lending syndicate operating out of the city port district. These men do not send collection letters or hire regular debt collectors, Sylvester. They send violent enforcers. They gave Kendrick a hard, non-negotiable deadline. If he does not clear the $3 million principal by the last day of this current month, they are going to take his life. That is why he is so incredibly desperate for your property. Your 3 acres of commercial land represent his only viable exit strategy to avoid a bullet." The sheer magnitude of his financial stupidity was staggering to comprehend. He had arrogantly gambled away his own future, and now he was actively conspiring to murder his own father to cover his catastrophic failures. "There is an immediate legal threat we need to address right now." Garrett continued, his tone growing even more urgent and serious. "Kendrick physically visited my downtown office 3 days ago. He aggressively demanded a certified copy of your durable power of attorney. He tried to bypass my security staff, claiming he was your designated financial proxy because you had recently shown severe signs of Alzheimer's disease. He audaciously stated you were no longer mentally fit to manage your estate, and that he needed to start liquidating your assets immediately to pay for your specialized medical care. My staff turned him away because he did not have the proper medical documentation, but he made it very clear he would return soon with a doctor's signature. Garrett paused, letting the immense weight of the information settle between us. Sylvester, if he gets a corrupt doctor to sign a certificate of incompetence, that power of attorney becomes active instantly. He will have total legal authority to sell your house, empty your bank accounts, and put you in a state facility against your will. He can do it all legally without your consent. We need to block him before he secures that medical document. I am already 10 steps ahead of him. Garrett, I replied, my eyes scanning the front driveway from my bedroom window. Have the blind trust documents completely ready for my signature. I will give you the signal when it is time to move. As I spoke, my smartphone buzzed sharply in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the bright screen. It was an automated fraud alert from my primary bank. A secondary credit card attached to my main account had just been swiped for exactly $5,000 at an upscale jewelry boutique downtown. That specific credit card was meant strictly for household groceries and emergency pharmacy visits. I had entrusted it to Heather to help with the household shopping. While my son was sweating in the dark basement trying to steal my property deed, his deceitful wife was out blowing my retirement funds on expensive diamond bracelets. They were maliciously spending my hard-earned money as if I were already dead and buried in the cemetery. I stared at the banking notification, feeling a cold, calculating smile form on my lips. Let them spend it, I thought. Let them dig their financial grave so incredibly deep they will never be able to climb out. I ended the call with Garrett and prepared for my next aggressive move. The time for hiding in the shadows was over. I needed a relentless operative on the ground who could drag Heather's dirty secrets into the blinding light. I drove to an old greasy diner on the industrial side of town, far away from the polished suburbs where my son and his deceitful wife spent their time. The neon sign outside buzzed with a flickering red light, casting long shadows on the pavement. The air inside smelled strongly of stale frying oil and burnt coffee. It was the perfect, discreet location to avoid anyone who might recognize me. Sitting in a dark corner booth facing the main entrance was DeAndre. He was a 40-year-old former police detective who had traded his official badge for highly lucrative private surveillance work. He was built like a professional linebacker, but he moved with the quiet, deliberate stealth of an apex predator. I slid into the cracked vinyl booth across from him and placed a thick, heavy envelope of untraceable cash on the table between us. DeAndre smoothly pocketed the envelope without even bothering to count it. I need absolute eyes and ears inside my own house, DeAndre, I said, keeping my voice hard and barely above a whisper. I need high-definition micro cameras in the living room, the kitchen, the basement, and especially the main hallways. There can be zero blind spots. My own son and his wife are actively planning to end my life and steal my entire estate. DeAndre nodded, his face entirely devoid of shock or surprise. He had seen the absolute worst of human nature during his long years on the police force. Consider the network installed, Mr. Sylvester, he replied, tapping his briefcase. I have the best equipment in my van right now. I will go in posing as a city pest control inspector while they are out running errands this afternoon. But before we get to the camera installation, DeAndre said, pulling a thick black manila folder from his leather briefcase. You asked me to run a deep, comprehensive background check on your daughter-in-law. What I found in her financial history is going to make your blood boil. He opened the heavy folder and spread a dozen glossy, high-resolution photographs across the sticky diner table. Heather has spent the last 3 years building this massive online persona as a holistic health guru and a deeply devoted family woman. She preaches to thousands about vegan diets, spiritual healing, and the beauty of marrying into a strong African-American family. It is all a highly produced, fraudulent illusion. DeAndre pointed a thick finger to a printed spreadsheet highlighting massive, recurring financial transfers. She has been secretly siphoning thousands of dollars from Kendrick's struggling logistics company to buy fake internet followers and artificial social media engagement. She is completely desperate for online fame and validation. But that financial drain is just the tip of the iceberg. Look closely at these surveillance shots. I picked up the photographs with a steady hand. They showed Heather walking into an exclusive upscale boutique hotel downtown. She was clinging tightly to the arm of a heavily muscled white man with a large tribal tattoo on his neck. The next photo showed them kissing passionately in the hotel lobby without a single ounce of shame. "That man is Bryce," DeAndre explained, leaning forward. "He is a high-end fitness instructor and personal trainer. Heather has been aggressively funding his lifestyle. She pays for his expensive downtown apartment, his luxury gym memberships, and his exotic weekend vacations. And she has not been using her own money to do it." DeAndre pulled out a printed bank statement and tapped a red circled line item. "Remember that $5,000 alert you got from your credit card this morning? She used your emergency card to buy Bryce a limited edition platinum watch for his birthday. She has been funding her illicit romantic affairs by bleeding your accounts dry." I stared intensely at the photographs of my son's wife locking lips with her secret personal trainer. She played the pious health expert online and the caring daughter-in-law in my house, but she was nothing more than a ruthless parasite. She was stealing the money I saved for groceries and vital medication to buy luxury gifts for her hidden lover, all while conspiring to murder me. The sheer audacity of her betrayal was staggering to process. Kendrick was drowning in a $3 million debt to the criminal underworld, and his wife was out blowing stolen funds on a fitness instructor. They were a match made in hell. Both of them were greedy, deceitful, and entirely devoid of morality. I felt a surge of cold, calculating rage crystallize deep in my chest. Heather thought she was so incredibly smart, playing us all for gullible fools. She had no idea that I now held the digital key to completely destroy her fake public image and her entire marriage in one single swift stroke. I looked down at the glossy image of Heather's smug, smiling face and felt a profound wave of bitter disappointment wash over me. I had strictly warned Kendrick about her motives years ago. I told him to be extremely careful of people who wear their virtues like a cheap costume. But Kendrick was totally blinded by her superficial charm and her aggressive social climbing ambition. He chose a woman who secretly despised our roots and our rich heritage. Heather constantly turned up her nose at the traditional foods Corinne used to cook. She subtly mocked the humble, working-class way we built our steady lives. She wanted the wealth and the financial stability of our family, but she had zero respect for the African-American culture and the generations of hard, grueling work that actually built it. Corinne scrubbed floors and worked brutal night shifts just so Kendrick could go to a prestigious university. He repaid his mother's ultimate sacrifice by bringing a venomous snake into our sanctuary. A woman who viewed our entire family legacy as nothing more than a convenient bank account to fund her vanity and her hidden sins. Kendrick had dug his own tragic grave the very day he put a diamond ring on her finger. I handed the incriminating photographs back to DeAndre and instructed him to digitize everything immediately. "Keep building the file," I commanded, my voice entirely stripped of emotion and completely steady. "I want every single text message, every hotel receipt, and every piece of video evidence you can possibly extract from her digital footprint. When I finally drop the heavy hammer on her, I want her completely buried under a mountain of undeniable proof." DeAndre nodded sharply, packing the confidential documents away safely. "I am heading to your property right now to install the surveillance network," he said, standing up from the booth. "Give me exactly 2 hours to drill the micro lenses into the drywall and sync the live feeds to your secure server. Do not return to the house until the late afternoon." I spent the next 2 hours walking aimlessly through the large city park, breathing in the crisp air and rehearsing my frail, confused persona. By the time I received the encrypted text message from DeAndre confirming the cameras were perfectly hidden and fully operational, I was totally prepared to step back onto the active battlefield. I caught a passing cab and returned to my quiet neighborhood. I walked slowly up my paved driveway, dragging my feet and adopting the hunched, defeated posture of a dying old man. I fumbled clumsily with my keys at the front door, making sure the metal jingled loudly to announce my pathetic arrival. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped into the dim foyer, expecting to find the house empty and quiet. Instead, the moment I crossed the threshold, a heavy, oppressive tension hung thickly in the air. I slowly raised my eyes and looked into the formal living room. Sitting perfectly upright on my leather sofa was Heather. She had changed out of her expensive shopping clothes and was wearing a modest conservative dress, playing the role of the deeply concerned relative. Sitting directly across from her, sipping a glass of iced water, was a man I had never seen before. He was in his late 50s, wearing a sharp, tailored suit underneath a pristine white medical lab coat. He had a sleek leather briefcase resting at his feet. Heather stood up immediately, her face plastered with a wide, predatory smile that made my skin crawl. "Oh, Dad, you are finally home," she announced, her voice echoing with artificial sweetness. "I want you to meet someone very special. This is Dr. Beaumont. He is a dear friend of the family, and he just dropped by to see how you are doing today." I stared at the man in the white coat, recognizing instantly that the executioner had arrived. I stood frozen in the foyer, letting my shoulders droop perfectly into the posture of a frightened and confused old man. The air in my own living room felt incredibly thick, suffocating with the silent threat of their impending trap. Heather walked over to me, linking her arm through mine with a firm grip that felt more like a shackle than an embrace. "Come sit down, Dad," she coaxed, guiding me toward the floral armchair. "Dr. Beaumont is a renowned specialist. He just wants to ask you a few simple questions to make sure you are feeling your absolute best." Kendrick stepped out from the hallway leading to his home office, adjusting his expensive tie. He nodded at the doctor, his face a mask of faux concern masking his desperate greed. I sank heavily into the armchair, letting my hands rest weakly on my knees. Dr. Beaumont smiled a practiced clinical smirk that did not reach his cold, dark eyes. He opened his sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a silver pen and a thick notepad. The stage was perfectly set. They thought they were cornering a helpless animal, but they had no idea they had just walked willingly into the lion's den. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Sylvester." Dr. Beaumont began, his voice dripping with condescension. "Your family has expressed some minor concerns about your memory lately. Can you tell me what day of the week it is today?" I let my jaw go slightly slack, staring blankly at the wall clock before turning my gaze to the window. "It is 1998, I mumbled softly, letting my voice trail off. "Tuesday, I think. Corinne said we needed to buy groceries for the Thanksgiving dinner." I looked directly at Heather. "Did you get the turkey, Corinne?" Heather let out a dramatic sigh, looking pointedly at the doctor. "See what we have to deal with," she whispered loudly. "It breaks my heart." Dr. Beaumont nodded slowly, scribbling furiously on his notepad. He leaned forward, invading my personal space. "And who is the current president, Mr. Sylvester?" I furrowed my brow violently, acting as if the mental strain was causing me physical pain. "The man with the saxophone," I answered, vaguely referencing a president from decades ago. I let my hands shake visibly. "My throat is so dry," I whispered. Kendrick immediately picked up a glass of ice water from the coffee table and handed it to me. His eyes were cold, practically begging me to fail. I reached out with both hands, deliberately letting my fingers spasm uncontrollably. Just as my skin brushed the cold condensation of the glass, I jerked my wrist. The glass slipped through my fingers and crashed onto the hardwood floor, shattering into dozens of sharp, jagged pieces. Water splashed across the expensive rug and soaked the hem of my trousers. "Oh no," I whimpered, shrinking back into the armchair, pulling my knees up defensively. "I am sorry, Corinne. I did not mean to drop it. My hands just do not work right anymore. Please do not be mad." Kendrick stepped back, shaking his head in mock pity while Heather quickly grabbed a towel from the kitchen. Dr. Beaumont did not even flinch at the sound of the breaking glass. He simply continued to write, his dark eyes scanning me like a specimen in a laboratory. "It is quite all right, Mr. Sylvester," the doctor said smoothly. "These little accidents happen when the cognitive pathways begin to deteriorate. Tell me about your house. Do you remember building it?" I launched into a rambling, incoherent story. I mixed up the dates, the locations, and the names of the contractors. I talked about mixing concrete in the middle of a blizzard that never happened. I described pouring the foundation in a city 300 miles away. I made sure my sentences trailed off into nothingness, leaving my thoughts hanging in the air like dead leaves. I was giving them the exact medical profile of a man whose brain was completely rotting away. I played the pathetic, broken victim so flawlessly that it almost made me sick to my stomach, but I knew every single tremor and every slurred word was a vital step towards securing their absolute destruction. Dr. Beaumont finally clicked his silver pen shut and closed his notepad with a sharp, definitive snap. He stood up, brushing an invisible piece of lint from his pristine white coat. The arrogance radiating from him was palpable. He looked down at me with utter contempt, dismissing my humanity completely. "Well, Kendrick," he said, turning to my son with a highly satisfied smirk, "the evaluation is unfortunately quite conclusive. The progressive cognitive decline is severe and irreversible." He is suffering from advanced stages of dementia compounded by fine motor skill deterioration. He is entirely incapable of managing his own financial or medical affairs. It is a textbook case, really. Kendrick let out a long, heavy breath, pressing his hands to his face in a theatrical display of grief. "So you can sign the certificate of incompetence today, Doctor." Beaumont exchanged a triumphant, knowing look with my son, a silent confirmation between two greedy criminals who believed they had just successfully executed the perfect heist. "I will have the official documents notarized and delivered to your attorney by tomorrow morning," Beaumont replied smoothly. "You are doing the right thing, Kendrick. He requires professional 24-hour care immediately." Heather offered to walk me up to my bedroom to rest while Kendrick escorted the doctor out. I shuffled heavily up the stairs, leaning entirely on the handrail, letting Heather guide me into my dark room. She pulled the covers over me, shutting the door with a sharp click. The moment the latch caught, my frail persona evaporated. I sat up, pulling my secure smartphone from my pocket. DeAndre's hidden surveillance network was active. I opened the application and tapped the kitchen camera feed. The high-definition video streamed perfectly. Kendrick and Dr. Beaumont were standing by the marble kitchen island. Kendrick reached into his tailored jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope bulging with $100 bills. He shoved it into Beaumont's eager hands. "That is $20,000 in untraceable cash, just like we agreed," Kendrick whispered, his voice picking up clearly on the microphone. "Make sure that medical certificate is absolutely bulletproof. I cannot afford any legal delays when I submit the power of attorney." Beaumont thumbed through the crisp bills, his eyes gleaming with greed. "It will hold up in any family court in the state," he assured, slipping the heavy envelope into his leather briefcase. "Pleasure doing business with you." The doctor walked out the back door, leaving Kendrick alone. My son leaned against the counter, wiping sweat from his forehead. He looked relieved, but the peace was instantly shattered. His cell phone began to vibrate violently against the hard marble. Kendrick flinched, staring at the screen as if it were a venomous snake. He hesitated before answering, putting the phone to his ear with a trembling hand. "Yes, I have the money," he stammered, his voice pitching higher in pure terror. "I told you the property transfer is happening this week. The doctor just signed the papers. Please, you have to give me until Friday. I swear I will have the full $3 million wired to your account." The voice on the other end was muffled, but Kendrick's face drained of all color. He swallowed hard. "Friday," he repeated desperately. "I promise. If I do not have the money by Friday, you can do whatever you want of me." He hung up the phone and slammed his fist into the countertop, letting out a ragged, terrified breath. I watched him from my dark bedroom, a cold smile forming on my face. The deadline was set. The evening arrived with a suffocating heaviness that settled over the entire house. I shuffled into the formal dining room, dragging my slippers across the expensive rugs. The long oak table was set for dinner. I had specifically requested braised short ribs, smothered in a rich dark gravy, just the way my late wife Corinne used to make for our Sunday family suppers. Heather placed a small, steaming plate in front of me, holding her breath and wrinkling her nose as if the very aroma of the traditional dish offended her delicate sensibilities. She sat down across from me, picking disdainfully at a glass bowl filled with raw kale and unseasoned quinoa. Her face contorted into a mask of pure disgust as she watched me pick up my heavy silver fork. She muttered something under her breath about clogged arteries and the primitive, uneducated nature of traditional soul food. Kendrick was too busy staring at the glowing screen of his smartphone to even notice the plate of expensive food sitting untouched in front of him. His face was ghostly pale, his mind clearly trapped in the terrifying countdown to his Friday deadline with the underground syndicate. I let my fork clatter loudly against the porcelain plate, making sure to chew my food slowly and deliberately. I wiped my mouth with a linen napkin, maintaining my vacant elderly stare, but my mind was actively sharpening its blades. It was time to push her buttons and test the absolute limits of her fake holistic patience. "This gravy is a little thin," I mumbled, letting a small drop of brown sauce spill intentionally onto my chin. Corinne always knew how to thicken it up just right. She used the heavy pan drippings. You never use the drippings, do you, Heather? You just pour water on things. Heather dropped her salad fork, letting it clink sharply against the glass bowl. "I am trying to keep you from having a massive coronary event, Dad." She snapped, her voice dripping with venomous condescension and barely contained rage. "My entire holistic lifestyle brand focuses on clean, organic living. I do not promote heavy, greasy food that drags people down into early graves. It is frankly irresponsible to eat like this in the modern world. You should be thanking me for caring about your cellular health." I tilted my head, blinking slowly, acting as though her harsh words were bouncing around a hollow, confused mind. Clean living, I repeated, letting out a soft, raspy chuckle that sounded like dry leaves scraping across pavement. You know, Corinne never had the luxury of time for clean living. She was too busy scrubbing other people's dirty floors to worry about her cellular health. Heather stiffened her posture, going completely rigid in her designer dining chair. "Do not bring her up," she hissed, glancing nervously at Kendrick, who was finally looking up from his phone screen. I ignored her completely, staring right through her perfectly contoured face. Corinne used to come home smelling like industrial bleach and cheap pine soap. I continued, my voice wavering perfectly on the edge of a senile ramble, but carrying an unmistakable razor-sharp edge. Her knees were completely ruined by the time she turned 45. She scrubbed the massive porcelain toilets of wealthy women up on the hill, women who looked and talked exactly like you, Heather. Women with perfect blonde hair and expensive yoga pants who genuinely thought they were better than everyone else because they drank expensive green juice while a black woman cleaned up their daily filth. I slammed my fist weakly on the table, making the expensive silverware rattle against the plates. She did not complain, though. Not once. Because she knew every toilet she scrubbed and every hardwood floor she waxed on her hands and knees was paying for Kendrick's fancy university tuition. Heather's face turned a violent shade of red. Her jaw clenched so tight I thought her porcelain veneer teeth might actually shatter. "Dad, that is enough," Kendrick intervened, his voice rising in sudden defense of his wife. "You are confused again. Your mind is slipping. Stop talking about Mom like that right now." But I was not finished. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, my eyes locking onto Heather's furious gaze. Corinne sacrificed her physical body so her only son could sit in a corporate boardroom instead of working in a damp basement. I whispered, the feigned confusion momentarily vanishing from my tone to deliver a strike of absolute clarity. You sit in her house eating your clean green leaves, looking down your nose on the hearty food that fueled her survival. You do not have the right to even speak her name in this dining room. You are not half the woman she was, and you never will be. I let my shoulders slump, immediately retreating back into the safety of my broken old man persona. "Where is my tea?" I mumbled softly, rubbing my temples with a trembling hand. My head hurts so much today. Kendrick stared at me, his mouth slightly open, completely thrown off balance by the sudden aggressive clarity, followed by my instant cognitive regression. The heavy truth I had just spoken hung in the air like a physical weight in the room. 20 years ago, Corinne worked brutal 12-hour shifts 7 days a week. She ignored her own failing health and swollen joints to ensure Kendrick could attend an Ivy League business school without drowning in student loans. We poured every ounce of our working-class blood into his polished professional future. And now he sat there in a tailored designer suit financed by violent criminals, letting a superficial, fraudulent internet influencer disrespect the very foundation of his privileged existence. He had eagerly traded his mother's profound legacy for a fake lifestyle and a mountain of underworld debt. The shame should have crushed his soul, but his greed was far too blinding for him to feel any real remorse. Heather slammed both her hands flat on the oak dining table. "I am not sitting here and listening to the delusional, aggressive insults of a dying old man," she screamed, her polished influencer facade completely shattering into pieces. She pushed her chair back violently and stormed out of the dining room, her heavy footsteps stomping aggressively up the wooden stairs toward the master bedroom. Kendrick shot me a dark, frustrated glare before chasing right after her, leaving his dinner completely untouched. I sat alone at the table, listening to their muffled arguments echoing through the ceiling boards. I calmly reached into my pocket, pulled out my secure smartphone, and opened the hidden surveillance application DeAndre had installed. I tapped the live feed for the master bedroom. The high-definition camera, hidden flawlessly inside the smoke detector, captured the chaotic scene perfectly. Heather was pacing back and forth, furiously throwing expensive decorative pillows off the bed and waving her arms frantically. "I cannot stand another minute in this house with him, Kendrick," she shrieked, pointing a manicured finger toward the floorboards. "I do not care what Dr. Beaumont said about timing or building a credible medical history. I want him gone right now. Increase the dosage tonight. Double it. Triple it. I do not care if his heart stops in his sleep. I am sick of the smell of him, and I am sick of his pathetic, guilt-tripping memories. Put the extra drops in his tea tonight, or I am leaving you and taking the car." Kendrick stood near the bedroom doorway, running his hands over his face in sheer panic. "Okay." He surrendered, his voice cracking under her relentless pressure. I will put a double dose in his cup tonight. Just calm down, Heather. We are so close to the finish line. I watched the digital screen with a cold, hollow satisfaction. They were recklessly accelerating their own demise. As I closed the live video feed, the screen of my phone flashed with a high-priority alert from my financial attorney, Garrett. It was an urgent, encrypted text message flagged with a bright red icon. Sylvester, the message read, "I just received a ping from my internal contacts at the National Credit Bureau. A commercial bridge loan application was just submitted electronically under your name and social security number. They are requesting $500,000 in immediate liquid cash using your secondary property deed as collateral. The application bears your exact signature." I stared at the glowing text message, absorbing the sheer magnitude of their desperation. A $500,000 bridge loan. Kendrick was not just trying to sell the main house to cover his syndicate debt. He was actively forging my signature to illegally siphon cash from every single asset I owned before the power of attorney was even officially filed with the state. The psychological warfare I had initiated at the dinner table was escalating into massive federal financial fraud. I smiled in the empty dining room, the glow of the phone illuminating my face. The heavy steel jaws of my trap were springing perfectly shut. Let them forge the documents, I thought. Every fake signature was another decade added to their federal prison sentences. The text message from Garrett was not enough for a situation this dire. Less than a minute later, my phone vibrated in my palm with an incoming call from him. I answered it immediately, keeping my voice low. Sylvester, Garrett said, his tone sharp and clinical. "The bridge loan application is live. $500,000. They used the secondary commercial lot you bought back in 1998 as the primary collateral. The bank's automated system flagged it for review, but the signature on the electronic file matches your current banking records perfectly. It is a masterful forgery." I listened to Garrett outline the swift, terrifying reality of modern financial theft. Kendrick was moving with the reckless speed of a man who had a loaded gun pointed at his head by the underground syndicate. "Can we freeze the disbursement?" I asked. "I can block it," Garrett replied. "But if we do, he will know you are legally competent and actively monitoring your assets. He will panic, and he might escalate to physical violence before we have all our pieces in place on the board." "Do not freeze it," I ordered smoothly. "Let the bank approve the funds. Give him enough rope to hang himself completely." I ended the call and opened the secure surveillance application on my phone, navigating directly to the hidden camera DeAndre had installed inside the air purifier in my ground floor home office. The high-definition infrared feed loaded instantly, revealing a scene of pathetic desperation. The timestamp on the recording showed Kendrick had been locked inside my office since 3 o'clock that afternoon. The room was illuminated only by the harsh white glow of my heavy brass desk lamp. Kendrick was sitting in my worn leather chair, hunched over the heavy mahogany desk. His expensive tailored jacket was thrown carelessly on the floor, and his sleeves were rolled up to his elbows. A thick layer of nervous sweat coated his forehead, glistening under the bright bulb. He looked absolutely haggard, driven mad by the ticking clock of his underworld debts. Spread across my desk were dozens of my old canceled checks, tax returns, and building permits I had archived over the past 3 decades. He had ransacked my filing cabinets, hunting for the clearest examples of my handwriting. In the center of the desk sat the official bridge loan application printed on crisp white paper. Next to it was a stack of tracing vellum and carbon paper. I watched in cold silence as my only son held a magnifying glass to one of my old checks, analyzing the precise loops and sharp angles of my signature. He picked up a fountain pen and began to practice on a blank sheet of scrap paper. His hand was shaking so badly he had to stop and grip his wrist to steady his own nerves. He took a deep, jagged breath, wiped his sweaty palms on his trousers, and tried again. He wrote my name over and over, hundreds of times. For 3 agonizing hours, I watched the fast-forwarded footage of his criminal dedication. He would sign a page, hold it up to the desk lamp, compare it to the original, and curse in sheer frustration before crumpling it into a ball and throwing it across the room. The floor was littered with his failures. He was not just stealing my money. He was meticulously stealing my identity, the very name I had spent a lifetime keeping honorable and clean. Finally, at 6 in the evening, he placed the carbon paper directly over the signature line of the bridge loan document. He traced the indentations with agonizing, slow precision, holding his breath. When he pulled the vellum away, he carefully traced over the faint blue lines with a heavy black ink pen. He held the final forged document up to the light, a sick, twisted smile of relief washing over his exhausted face. He had successfully committed federal bank fraud right at my own desk. He carefully wiped his fingerprints from the desk surface, gathered his crumpled practice sheets, and stuffed them into his briefcase, ensuring no physical evidence of his desperate forgery remained behind. He thought he was a criminal mastermind, completely unaware he was the star of his own highly documented federal indictment. I forwarded the entire uninterrupted 3-hour video file directly to DeAndre's encrypted server. 10 minutes later, my burner phone chimed. DeAndre was on the line. I received the footage. Mr. Sylvester, the former detective, said, his voice devoid of judgment but heavy with grim realization. It is a clear-cut felony. We have him dead to rights on forgery and wire fraud. I stared out the dining room window into the dark yard. You know DeAndre? I said, my voice dangerously calm and entirely devoid of sorrow. When Kendrick was 5 years old, he struggled terribly with his fine motor skills. He could not hold a pencil correctly. His kindergarten teacher said he was falling behind. Corinne was so worried. So every single night after working a 12-hour shift pouring concrete, I would sit with him right at that exact same mahogany desk. I would wrap my large calloused hands around his tiny fingers, guiding the pencil over the paper. We practiced his loops and his sharp angles for hours until his handwriting was perfect. I gave him the steady hand he just used to sign away my life. DeAndre remained silent on the other end, respecting the heavy gravity of the memory. The bank just greenlit the bridge loan he finally reported, breaking the quiet tension. The automated system processed the forged application and pushed the $500,000 into the joint emergency account you share with Kendrick. But he is not the only one moving fast. Heather set up a digital alert on that specific account. The second the funds cleared the wire, she executed an immediate external transfer. She pulled exactly $50,000 clean out of the newly deposited loan money. Where did she send it? I asked, my tone shifting back to the cold, calculated precision of a man orchestrating a war. She wired it directly to a luxury automotive dealership downtown. DeAndre replied, the rapid clicking of his keyboard audible in the background. I already pulled the sales invoice. She put a massive cash down payment on a brand new convertible sports car. The vehicle registration is exclusively under the name of Bryce, the personal trainer she has been sleeping with at the boutique hotel. Your daughter-in-law did not even wait 24 hours to spend your stolen collateral on her secret lover. A humorless, dry laugh escaped my chest. The level of internal betrayal was staggering. Kendrick was risking decades in a federal penitentiary to secure funds to save his own life from violent loan sharks, and his wife was instantly bleeding that exact same stolen money to finance her illicit romance. They were two parasites feeding off the same dying host, completely unaware that they were slowly cannibalizing each other. Let the transaction clear, I instructed DeAndre. I want the digital receipt, the wire transfer logs, and the dealership invoice added to her permanent file. When this all comes crashing down, she is going to have to explain to a federal judge why she used fraudulent mortgage funds to buy her boyfriend a luxury car. Understood, DeAndre said. But we have a much more pressing situation arriving at your front door tomorrow morning, Mr. Sylvester. My surveillance on Kendrick's phone records picked up a confirmed calendar appointment. He reached out to an aggressive commercial real estate broker earlier today. They are bringing a team of commercial appraisers and land developers to your house tomorrow at 10 in the morning to visually inspect the property for the $4 million teardown sale. They are moving to sell the ground right out from under your feet. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 10 when the heavy oak front door swung open. Kendrick walked in leading a pack of 4 men dressed in sharp, tailored suits. They carried leather portfolios, digital tablets, and advanced laser measuring devices. They completely ignored me sitting in the floral armchair as if I were just another piece of outdated furniture waiting to be hauled to the landfill. Kendrick gestured expansively around the living room, pointing to the high vaulted ceilings and the wide bay windows. They began marching through my home, pointing flashing lasers at the walls and aggressively tapping on their bright screens. I sat perfectly still, letting my jaw hang slightly slack, clutching a worn plaid blanket over my knees. I listened intently as they coldly calculated the demolition costs, discussing how easily the heavy commercial machinery could level the foundation I had poured with my own hands 30 years ago. They talked openly about zoning permits, commercial access roads, and tearing up the ancient oak trees in the backyard. It was a brazen, arrogant violation of my sanctuary. They were measuring my home for its coffin right in front of my face, completely confident that my drug-addled brain could not comprehend their aggressive intrusion. The lead broker, a tall man with a slicked-back haircut and an expensive silk tie, finished scanning the dimensions of the formal dining room. He walked back into the living area, sliding his digital tablet into his leather briefcase. He looked down at me with a patronizing, pitying smirk. He clearly thought he was being charming and accommodating to a broken mind. "Well, Mr. Sylvester," he said, his voice artificially loud and slow, as if speaking to a toddler. "You must be very excited about the big move. I hear the Sunrise Valley Care Facility has a beautiful courtyard, much less space to worry about cleaning right." Kendrick completely froze. The color drained instantly from his face. He shot a furious, panicked glare at the broker, waving his hands frantically behind his back to signal the man to shut his mouth immediately. He had strictly instructed them to pretend this was an insurance appraisal, not a pre-demolition walkthrough. He was terrified that the sudden mention of a nursing home might snap me out of my sedated fog and trigger an aggressive, lucid episode. I slowly turned my head, looking up at the slick broker with wide, vacant eyes. I let the silence stretch out, allowing the tension to fill the room like a heavy, suffocating gas. Kendrick took a step forward, his hands trembling at his sides. "Dad," he interrupted, his voice cracking slightly. "The gentleman is just confused," he meant to say. I cut Kendrick off simply by raising a single trembling finger. "The nursing home," I asked, my voice, soft and raspy, echoing perfectly the tone of a lost old man. "I do not think I will be going to a nursing home." The broker chuckled nervously, glancing at Kendrick, who was now actively sweating through his expensive dress shirt. "Oh, do not worry, sir," the broker pushed on, entirely missing the terrifying gravity of the situation. "It is a top-tier facility. You will be well taken care of while your son handles the heavy lifting here." I smiled, a slow, chilling curve of the lips that did not reach my deadened eyes. "No," I murmured, tilting my head as if trying to recall a fading memory. "I cannot leave this house. I built it, you see. I dug the deep trenches and mixed the mortar myself. I know exactly what lies beneath the floorboards. I know every dark corner of the basement. If someone tries to take me away from my home, the house will not let them. It is very unforgiving to trespassers." Kendrick swallowed audibly, taking a hesitant step back. The broker's patronizing smile faded, replaced by a look of profound discomfort. It was the exact type of rambling nonsense a severe dementia patient might mutter, but the cold, absolute certainty in my voice sent a visible shiver down Kendrick's spine. He knew the sheer depth of his own guilt, and my seemingly innocent words struck the darkest paranoid corners of his mind. He quickly grabbed the broker by the elbow and began ushering him toward the front door, his breathing shallow and frantic. Just before they crossed the threshold, I called out to them one last time. My voice sliced through the nervous silence, forcing them to stop in their tracks. "You should be extremely careful with the demolition," I said, staring blankly at the far wall. "The bricks are not standard. I reinforced every single wall with a solid steel core and double-packed industrial concrete. I did it to keep the fierce winter storms out so Corinne would never be cold." I let a hollow, dry laugh escape my chest. "It is a fortress. The walls are so incredibly thick. Once the heavy doors are locked tight, nobody on the outside can hear a single sound. You could scream at the top of your lungs in the basement and not even the neighbors standing on the porch would know you were there. It is a very quiet place to be trapped." The broker looked deeply disturbed, gripping his briefcase tightly as if he wanted to run. Kendrick looked like he was about to vomit. He shoved the men out the front door and slammed it shut, his chest heaving as he leaned heavily against the thick wood. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. He did not say a single word to me. He pushed off the front door and practically ran up the wooden staircase, taking the steps 2 at a time. I remained perfectly still in my armchair, waiting for the distinct slam of the master bedroom door on the second floor. The moment the house was quiet, my frail posture vanished. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my secure smartphone, opening the surveillance application DeAndre had installed. I immediately tapped the live audio feed for the master bedroom. Kendrick was pacing the floor aggressively, his heavy footsteps vibrating through the sensitive microphone. "He is creeping me out." Heather, Kendrick shouted, his voice echoing with sheer panic. He was looking right through me downstairs. He was talking about screaming in the basement and being trapped inside the walls. It is like he knows what we are doing. What if the tea is not making him forget? What if it is making him crazy? Heather sighed loudly, clearly annoyed by his sudden lack of composure. Calm down, Kendrick. It is just the toxins frying his neural pathways. Dr. Beaumont said severe hallucinations and paranoid rambling are standard side effects of the heavy metal buildup in his system. It means the dosage is working perfectly. No, it is taking too long, Kendrick countered, his voice cracking under the immense pressure. The commercial brokers are ready to draw up the $4 million contract by Friday, but the syndicate enforcers sent me a violent message this morning. They threw a dead rat soaked in gasoline onto the hood of my car at the office. They are not waiting for medical certificates or probate courts. If I do not have the deed signed over and the cash moving by the weekend, they are going to execute me in the street. I cannot wait for this poison to slowly shut his organs down. Heather was silent for a terrifying moment. Then her voice came through the feed, cold and entirely devoid of basic human empathy. Then we do not wait, she stated flatly. If the cognitive decline is not fast enough, we need a sudden catastrophic physical trauma. He is an old, frail man, Kendrick. Old men lose their balance all the time. Old men fall down the stairs. They fall hard and they break their necks. We just need to make sure he takes a tumble he cannot recover from. Tomorrow when I am at the gym, you need to set the stage. A tragic accident at home. The audio feed buzzed softly. The ultimate boundary had just been crossed. They were abandoning the slow poison. They were moving to active physical murder. The house was perfectly dark when the silent notification flashed on my phone screen. It was exactly 2 a.m. I sat up in my bed and tapped the motion sensor alert from the hallway camera. The night vision feed bathed the second-floor landing in a ghostly green glow. Kendrick crept out of the master bedroom, moving with the exaggerated stealth of a guilty man. He carried a small toolkit and a plastic bottle. I watched him kneel at the very top of the main oak staircase. He pulled a screwdriver from the kit and began systematically loosening the heavy brass brackets that anchored the wooden handrail to the drywall. He worked quickly, removing just enough screws to ensure the railing would completely detach and collapse under any real weight. Once the structural integrity was utterly compromised, he stood up and unscrewed the cap of the plastic bottle. He carefully poured a thick layer of clear lubricating oil directly onto the polished wood of the top step, spreading it evenly with a rag. He was setting a deadly kinetic trap. One slip on the oiled wood, an instinctive grab for the weakened handrail, and a fatal plunge down 22 steep oak stairs to the hard marble foyer below. I waited until 9 the next morning. Heather left in her yoga gear, driving off to meet her secret lover, while Kendrick rushed out to his failing logistics company, undoubtedly counting the hours until my sudden tragic demise. As soon as I heard the heavy garage door close, I dropped the frail act entirely. I pulled out my burner phone and called Marcus, a master carpenter and a structural specialist who used to run heavy crews on my commercial job sites. He owed me his career, and he was fiercely loyal. He arrived at my back door less than 20 minutes later, carrying 2 heavy tool bags and a portable welding kit. I pointed him straight to the staircase and explained exactly what needed to be done without giving him the dark, underlying context. Marcus was a professional. He asked 0 questions and immediately went to work. First, we stripped the greasy, lubricating oil from the top step using industrial degreaser, drying the polished oak until it was completely pristine. Then Marcus applied a specialized, transparent, anti-slip traction tape across the edge of every single step from top to bottom. It was virtually invisible to the naked eye, but provided the gripping power of coarse sandpaper, ensuring absolutely no one would ever lose their footing. Then came the compromised handrail. Kendrick had foolishly loosened the visible brass brackets, but he had no idea how the internal support system was actually designed. Marcus completely removed the wooden rail and bored deep pilot holes directly through the drywall and straight into the heavy structural support studs I had framed the house with 30 years ago. He inserted solid half-inch steel lag bolts, securing the brackets with a pneumatic impact wrench that drove them in with bone-rattling force. We did not stop there. Marcus ran a continuous carbon steel reinforcement bar along the underside of the oak handrail, locking it into place with specialized industrial epoxy. By the time he finished packing up his tools at noon, that handrail was not just a piece of decorative wood. It was a load-bearing structural anchor capable of supporting the weight of a commercial truck. You could hit that railing with a heavy sledgehammer, and it would not even vibrate. I paid Marcus generously in cash and saw him out the back door. I spent the next hour meticulously cleaning up any trace of wood dust or metal shavings. I restored the hallway to its exact previous appearance, ensuring the deadly illusion Kendrick had constructed remained visually undisturbed. I vacuumed the carpet runners and polished the brass brackets so they gleamed just as they had the night before. I tested the grip on the top step with my leather slippers, feeling the aggressive bite of the traction tape catching the sole perfectly. The trap had been entirely neutralized and inverted into an impenetrable fortress. Kendrick thought he was playing a clever game of physics and gravity, but he was attempting to battle a master engineer inside his own structural domain. Standing alone in the quiet foyer, I looked up at the sweeping oak staircase. A profound, agonizing sorrow washed over me, piercing through the cold armor of my tactical mindset. I remembered the exact day I installed those wooden treads. Kendrick was just a toddler, barely pulling himself up on the furniture to practice his clumsy first steps. Corinne was terrified he would fall and hurt himself on the rough construction materials, so I spent 3 straight days on my hands and knees with a heavy block of sandpaper. I manually sanded every single inch of that oak staircase until the wood was as smooth as polished glass. My fingers blistered and bled, but I kept working. Corinne brought me cold lemonade and wiped the sweat from my brow, smiling down at the boy who was eagerly trying to climb the very first step. I meticulously rounded every sharp corner and inspected every plank to ensure my son would never catch a single splinter in his tiny hands. I built this staircase to be his safe passage to elevate him and protect him as he learned to walk. Now he had weaponized my own labor of love against me, turning the very steps I smoothed for his absolute safety into an executioner's drop. Night fell over the house like a heavy velvet shroud. Heather and Kendrick were sitting in the downstairs living room, the television volume turned up slightly higher than usual to mask the sickening sound of the fatal crash they were eagerly anticipating. I stood at the top of the dark landing dressed in my thick bathrobe. I knew Kendrick was lurking just out of sight near the bottom archway, his heart pounding with greedy expectation. I did not shuffle. I did not drag my slippers across the floorboards. I stood up straight, rolling my shoulders back and taking a deep, steadying breath. I stepped firmly onto the top step. My leather slipper hit the transparent anti-slip tape, gripping the wood with absolute total security. I reached out and wrapped my large hand around the oak handrail. I squeezed it, pulling my entire body weight against it. It did not budge a single millimeter. It felt like grabbing a solid steel girder bolted directly into the bedrock. I began my descent. I brought my foot down hard on the next step, letting the heavy thud echo loudly down the stairwell. Thud, thud, thud. I walked down the 22 steps with the aggressive, confident stride of a commanding general inspecting his troops. The sound was impossible to ignore. It was not the weak, hesitant shuffle of a dying man heavily medicated on sedatives. It was the rhythmic, unstoppable march of a man who owned the very ground he walked upon. I reached the marble foyer and turned smoothly toward the kitchen, completely bypassing the dark corner where Kendrick was hiding in the shadows. I walked past him, grabbed a glass of water from the refrigerator, and headed back to the stairs. As I passed the dark archway again, I caught a glimpse of his face, illuminated briefly by the moonlight filtering through the window. He was completely frozen, his mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. He watched me climb back up the stairs with the exact same heavy, effortless stride. When I reached the top landing and stepped into my bedroom, I left the door cracked open just an inch. I watched through the narrow gap. Kendrick stepped out of the shadows, moving like a ghost toward the staircase. He reached out with a trembling hand and grabbed the oak handrail. He yanked it violently with both hands, planting his feet and leaning backward. His body jerked aggressively, but the wood remained completely motionless. He ran his fingers over the brass brackets, feeling the massive steel lag bolts anchored deep into the wall. He stumbled backward, gripping his own hair in absolute panic, staring up the dark stairwell. He realized right then that his deadly trap had completely failed and the house he was trying to steal was actively fighting back. The morning sun brought a deceptive calm to the house, but my internal radar was fully alert. After the failed staircase trap, I knew Kendrick and Heather would escalate their desperation. They needed liquid cash fast. I walked into my bedroom closet and knelt to check the false floor panel beneath my heavy oak dresser. It was a secret compartment I built specifically to safeguard Corinne's most precious belongings away from prying eyes. I slid my fingers along the seamless wooden joint, but the panel gave way too easily. The hidden lock had been brutally pried open with a heavy flathead screwdriver. Jagged wood splinters littered the carpet. I pulled the panel completely back. The velvet-lined interior was entirely empty. Corinne's antique jewelry collection was gone. Every single piece of her legacy, the gold bangles, the diamond earrings, and the vintage brooches had been stolen from the very heart of my sanctuary. They were not just content with trying to murder me or stealing my commercial land. They were actively plundering the sacred memories of a dead woman to fund their pathetic, selfish lives. The sheer disrespect ignited a new level of fury. My phone vibrated in my pocket before I could even stand up from the closet floor. It was a text message from DeAndre. He had been closely tracking Heather's movements since she left the house under the guise of attending a morning yoga class. "She is not at the fitness studio, Mr. Sylvester," the message read. "She just pulled into a shady strip mall on the east side of town. She walked into a cash for gold pawn shop carrying a heavy velvet bag. I am sending you the exact location coordinates now." I grabbed my keys and walked straight out the front door. I drove my old reliable sedan across town, my jaw clenched so tight my teeth physically ached. I parked a block away and met DeAndre in the dirty alley behind the pawn shop. "She walked out 5 minutes ago counting a thick stack of $100 bills," DeAndre reported, handing me a small digital camera with the surveillance photos. "She fenced the whole bag for pennies on the dollar to fuel her luxury shopping habits." I nodded and pushed aggressively through the heavy glass door of the pawn shop. The entry bell chimed loudly. The owner, a greasy man wearing a thick gold chain, looked up from his messy counter. "Can I help you, old-timer?" he grunted, wiping his hands on a dirty rag. I walked right up to the display case and slammed a thick stack of untraceable $100 bills directly onto the scratched glass. "I am here to buy back the exact velvet bag the blonde woman just sold you 10 minutes ago," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, unyielding rumble. The owner hesitated, eyeing the massive pile of cash. "Look, man, a deal is a deal," he started, crossing his arms. I cut him off immediately, pulling another thick stack of bills from my jacket and dropping it next to the first. "This is double what you just paid her. You are going to hand over the jewelry right now. You are also going to print a full copy of the official transaction receipt bearing her exact signature. And finally, you are going to download the last hour of your security camera footage onto this digital flash drive." The owner looked at the money, then looked at the cold, unyielding expression on my face. He recognized a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. He quietly scooped up the cash, retreated to his secure back room, and returned with Corinne's familiar velvet bag. He printed the receipt, sliding it across the counter along with the digital flash drive. I checked the printed paper. Heather had brazenly signed her own name, certifying she was the lawful owner of the stolen property. It was a direct, documented felony. I had her dead to rights on grand theft and fencing stolen goods. I walked out to my car and sat alone in the driver's seat, opening the velvet bag to inspect the recovered contents. My hands finally trembled, not from fake dementia, but from pure, overwhelming grief. Sitting at the very top of the glittering pile was a simple, delicate strand of freshwater pearls. Those pearls were not just expensive jewelry. They were the very last gift I gave Corinne for our 30th wedding anniversary. She wore them every single day, even when the aggressive cancer took over her frail body. In her final hours, lying quietly in the sterile hospice bed, she took them off her neck and pressed them firmly into my rough hands. She told me to keep them safe and pass them down to a woman who truly understood the deep, profound meaning of real love and hard, grueling work. Heather was the absolute antithesis of everything Corinne stood for. The thought of that deceitful woman aggressively shoving these sacred pearls across a dirty glass counter just to buy designer items for her secret lover made my blood boil with a white-hot intensity. I drove back to the house, making sure I arrived long before Heather finished her fake morning errands. I walked straight up the wooden stairs and directly into the master bedroom she shared with my son. The room smelled sickeningly of her expensive floral perfume, a scent that now made my stomach turn. I marched over to her pristine, mirrored vanity table and placed Corinne's velvet bag directly in the absolute center. I arranged the pearl necklace carefully, allowing it to spill out beautifully over the dark velvet fabric. Then I took a thick black permanent marker and wrote a single sentence on a blank piece of heavy stationery paper. I leaned the handwritten note against the pearls where she could not possibly miss it. The message read, "Stolen goods carry a very heavy weight." I retreated to my own room, leaving my door cracked just enough to monitor the hallway without being seen. An hour later, I heard the heavy front door open. Heather's high heels clicked aggressively across the marble foyer and up the wooden stairs. She was humming a cheerful, upbeat pop tune, entirely convinced she had just pulled off the perfect lucrative crime. The humming stopped abruptly the exact second she stepped into her bedroom. I heard a sharp, sudden gasp of pure, unfiltered terror. The heavy silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife. Through the narrow, cracked door, I watched her stumble backward out of the bedroom, her hands covering her mouth, her face completely drained of all color. She was staring at the velvet bag as if it were a highly explosive bomb about to detonate. She knew immediately that her blatant theft had been discovered and completely reversed, but she had absolutely no idea who had done it. She practically lunged for her designer handbag, pulling out her cell phone with violently shaking hands. She dialed a number rapidly and pressed the phone to her ear, pacing the hallway like a trapped, cornered animal. "Kendrick," she hissed, her voice completely raw with panic and breathlessness. "Kendrick, you need to get home right now. Somebody was in our bedroom. The jewelry I took from the old man's closet is sitting right on my vanity. Someone bought it back and left a terrifying note. No, it could not be your father. He is a brain-dead vegetable. Someone else knows what we are doing, Kendrick. Someone is inside the house playing a psychological game with us. Get home before I call the police myself." I closed my door with a soft, silent click. The toxic paranoia was officially consuming them from the inside out. Kendrick arrived less than 20 minutes later, his car tires screeching against the driveway pavement. I watched the live feed from the bedroom camera as he burst through the door, chest heaving. He saw the pearls and the handwritten note on the vanity. Instead of comforting his terrified wife, he turned on her with a vicious snarl. "You absolute idiot," he shouted, pointing a shaking finger at her face. "I told you not to touch anything in this house until the paperwork was cleared." Heather fired back instantly, her fear mutating into defensive rage. "Do not you dare put this on me, Kendrick. You did this. You put the bag back to scare me. You want to keep all the money for yourself. I know how your greedy mind works." Kendrick grabbed his own hair, looking like a man completely unhinged. "Why would I buy back stolen jewelry when I owe $3 million to a cartel?" "Someone is watching us, Heather. You probably fenced the goods to an undercover cop, or one of your stupid gym boyfriends got greedy." Their alliance, built on deceit and mutual financial parasitism, began to fracture violently under the crushing weight of their own escalating paranoia. The fierce argument exhausted them, leaving a bitter, toxic silence hanging in the room. Kendrick collapsed onto the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the floor. "Every single plan we make blows up in our faces," he muttered, his voice hollow and defeated. "The stairs did not work. The old man is walking around like a tank. Now someone is actively taunting us with stolen property. We are completely out of time and out of options." Heather crossed her arms, glaring at him. "So what do we do? Do we just pack our bags and wait for the police to arrest us, or for your loan sharks to shoot us?" Kendrick suddenly stood up, his posture rigid with a dark, manic energy. He walked over to his heavy leather briefcase resting on the armchair and clicked the brass locks open. He pulled out 2 thick manila folders. He tossed them onto the bed next to Heather. "We stop waiting for nature or accidents to take their course," he declared, his tone vibrating with reckless determination. "We execute the final phase right now." Heather opened the first folder. "It is the medical certificate," she noted, running her manicured fingers over the crisp paper. Beaumont signed it. "And the second folder holds the forged power of attorney," Kendrick added, tapping the documents aggressively. "I spent 3 hours perfecting that signature. It is completely flawless. The bank already accepted a minor version of it for the bridge loan. A high-tier commercial notary will not even blink when I present this. I am legally his absolute proxy. I am the sole controller of his estate." Heather looked up, her eyes narrowing. "But the property is not officially listed yet. Who is going to buy a $4 million commercial lot on a 3-day notice?" Kendrick smiled, a desperate, ugly expression that contorted his features. "Carmichael," he answered. "He is the biggest commercial developer in the city. He has been aggressively trying to buy up this specific zoning block for 5 years. I called his private office yesterday. I told his acquisitions manager that my father has severe dementia and we need a rapid liquid cash sale to cover extreme medical debts. Carmichael is a ruthless shark. He loves a distressed fire sale. He offered $3.5 million cash completely under the table with an expedited closing. We signed the deed over directly to his holding company on Friday morning, and he wires the funds by Friday afternoon." Color returned to Heather's pale face. $3.5 million, she whispered, the sheer greed instantly overriding her lingering fear. "But what about the old man? What if he causes a scene at the notary office? Kendrick sneered, walking over to the bedroom window and looking down at the street. We will heavily drug his morning tea on Friday. We will dress him up, put him in a wheelchair if we have to, and park him in the corner of the boardroom. Carmichael just needs to see a warm body that matches Beaumont's dementia diagnosis. Once the ink dries on that contract, the money is ours and the house belongs to the developer. We pay off the syndicate and we disappear. Kendrick's sheer terror was not just born of financial ruin, it was driven by the visceral threat of brutal physical violence. Earlier that morning, before the pawnshop incident, DeAndre had sent me a highly disturbing surveillance update from Kendrick's downtown logistics office. When my son arrived at his workplace, he found a heavy cardboard box resting directly on his desk. Inside was a massive dead city rat completely soaked in industrial gasoline. Pinned to the rat with a hunting knife was a single piece of paper bearing a terrifying message. Friday at noon. Your money or your life. The underground syndicate was no longer sending polite warnings or making threatening phone calls. They were demonstrating exactly what they planned to do to him if his massive debt remained unpaid. The gasoline-soaked rat was a very clear indicator that they intended to burn his life to the ground. That terrifying ultimatum was the absolute driving force behind this sudden desperate rush to the notary. He was literally running for his life, willing to commit massive federal fraud to avoid a violent execution in the streets. My encrypted burner phone buzzed against the kitchen counter, interrupting my thoughts. I picked it up. It was Garrett. "Sylvester, my old friend Garrett," said, his voice buzzing with a sharp, predatory excitement. "My internal contacts at Carmichael's real estate firm just sent me a highly confidential heads up. Kendrick officially booked a private boardroom at Carmichael's downtown headquarters. The closing appointment is locked in for this Friday at 10 o'clock in the morning. They hired a private commercial notary to validate the property transfer. Kendrick is bringing the forged power of attorney and the fake medical certificate." I smiled, a cold, hard expression that reflected in the dark glass of the kitchen window. The pieces were finally all converging on the exact spot I wanted them. "Let him bring his fake papers, Garrett," I replied, my voice steady and completely devoid of mercy. "It is time to initiate the final sequence. Have your legal team finalize the blind trust documents tonight. Bring the paperwork to my house through the back alley at midnight. I want every single asset I own transferred into that irrevocable trust before the sun comes up tomorrow." Garrett chuckled, a deep rumbling sound of approval. "Consider it done. By the time Kendrick sits down at that mahogany boardroom table on Friday, your signature will not be worth a single dime because you will technically own absolutely nothing. The trust will hold the fortress. Friday is going to be a very bad day for your son." I ended the call and walked upstairs to my master bedroom. I opened my heavy cedar closet and pushed aside my casual daily clothes. In the very back, encased in a protective plastic cover, hung the finest tailored suit I owned. A sharp charcoal gray three-piece suit I had specifically bought for my retirement celebration years ago. I pulled it out and hung it carefully on the heavy wooden valet stand. I polished my black leather Oxfords until they gleamed like dark mirrors. Kendrick and Heather thought they were going to drag a drooling, medicated old fool into a corporate boardroom to quietly steal his legacy. They were preparing for a funeral. But I was preparing for a highly calculated public execution. I looked at my reflection in the full-length mirror, straightening my posture until I stood at my full, towering height. The endgame was officially in motion. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight, sending low, rhythmic chimes through the silent house. I stood by the kitchen window, watching the dark alleyway behind my property. A sleek black sedan rolled to a stop with its headlights completely off. A figure stepped out, moving with practiced stealth, holding a thick leather briefcase. It was Nolan, a highly trusted senior paralegal working directly under Garrett. I had purposely left the heavy deadbolt on the back patio door unlocked. Nolan slipped through the shadows of the large oak trees and stepped inside, closing the glass door without making a single sound. He wore a dark overcoat and gave me a curt professional nod. We did not exchange any pleasantries because the gravity of the night required absolute silence. Kendrick and Heather were sound asleep on the second floor, utterly convinced their fraudulent scheme was moving forward flawlessly. I led Nolan down the narrow hallway and into my private home office, gently shutting the heavy mahogany door behind us. I pulled the thick blackout curtains tight across the windows, ensuring not a sliver of light could escape into the yard. I flicked on the small brass desk lamp, casting a warm, dim glow across the wooden surface. Nolan opened his leather briefcase and extracted a massive stack of legal documents printed on heavy archival paper. He laid them out across the mahogany desk with the precision of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. Every single page represented a lifetime of grueling work, early mornings pouring concrete, and decades of calculated investments. These were the keys to my kingdom. Garrett sent his absolute best work, Nolan whispered, sliding a sleek metallic fountain pen across the desk. This is the irrevocable blind trust formation packet. We have the property deeds, the commercial land titles, the secondary bridge loan accounts, and your primary liquid asset portfolios. Everything is queued up for immediate digital and physical transfer. I picked up the heavy pen, feeling the cool metal against my calloused fingers. I looked down at the first document. It was the master deed to the very house we were standing in the fortress I had built for Corinne. I felt a brief pang of nostalgia, but it was instantly crushed by the cold reality of my mission. I did not hesitate. I pressed the nib to the paper and signed my name with sharp, flawless precision. There were no trembling hands tonight. There was no hesitation or cognitive fog. I moved systematically through the towering stack of paperwork. I signed away my commercial lots. I signed away my high-yield savings accounts. I transferred the title of the secondary property, the exact same property Kendrick had fraudulently used as collateral for his $500,000 bridge loan. Page after page, signature after signature, I systematically stripped myself of every single tangible asset I owned. In the eyes of the law, I was rapidly becoming a man who possessed absolutely nothing. And that was exactly the ultimate source of my untouchable power. Kendrick was currently sleeping upstairs, dreaming of the $4 million teardown sale he had scheduled with Carmichael for Friday morning. He was banking entirely on the forged power of attorney he had spent 3 agonizing hours practicing right at this very desk. But a power of attorney only grants control over assets that the principal actually owns. By signing these documents tonight, I was pulling the rug entirely out from under his desperate feet. The moment the morning sun rose, his meticulously forged document would be legally worthless. It would be a meaningless piece of scrap paper trying to control a financial empire that no longer existed under my name. The sheer poetic justice of it fueled my every stroke of the pen. I finished the final page, pressing my personal seal firmly next to my signature. Nolan gathered the heavy stack, tapping the edges against the desk to align them perfectly. He slid them back into his briefcase and locked the brass clasps. "The transfer is officially executed, Mr. Sylvester," he said, his voice laced with deep respect. "Garrett will file the digital timestamp with the state registry the exact second the courts open tomorrow morning. You are officially untouchable. Under the strict frameworks of United States federal and state property law, an irrevocable blind trust is an absolute financial fortress. Once a grantor transfers their assets into this specific type of trust, they completely surrender all direct control and visible ownership of those assets to an appointed independent trustee. In this case, Garrett was the designated executor. Because the trust is irrevocable, it cannot be altered, modified, or dissolved by anyone, not even by me. This created an impenetrable legal shield. If a predatory family member tries to invoke a power of attorney or presents a medical certificate claiming the original owner is mentally incompetent, the courts will simply dismiss them. The assets are legally insulated. The medical certificate Dr. Beaumont illegally signed for Kendrick was now a useless prop. Kendrick could march into any bank or commercial real estate office in the country waving his fraudulent proxy papers, but no financial institution could execute a sale. You cannot sell land that the assigned principal does not legally own. By shifting my entire estate into this invisible vault, I had effectively vaporized the exact collateral Kendrick needed to save his life from the underground syndicate. Nolan slipped out the back door exactly as quietly as he had arrived, disappearing into the dark alleyway. I returned to my bedroom and lay down, pulling the heavy quilt over my chest. I slept for a solid 4 hours, a deep, dreamless sleep, fueled by the sheer satisfaction of total strategic victory. When the morning light broke through the window, I maintained my broken, frail routine. I shuffled down to the kitchen where Heather was already aggressively chopping organic vegetables for her internet followers. Kendrick was sitting at the marble kitchen island, dressed in his expensive tailored suit, gripping his smartphone. I watched him closely through my half-open eyes. He was nervously tapping his foot against the bar stool, completely consumed by his financial anxiety. He unlocked his phone and opened his primary banking application to check the balances. He needed absolute assurance that the $500,000 fraudulent bridge loan and the remaining liquid cash were still resting safely in the joint accounts ready to be deployed after the massive real estate closing on Friday. What Kendrick did not know was that DeAndre was a master of digital manipulation. Late last night, after the trust transfer was initiated, DeAndre had remotely intercepted the local network router connecting to Kendrick's smartphone. He had seamlessly routed Kendrick's specific banking application through a localized proxy server. The screen Kendrick was staring at right now was a highly sophisticated dummy interface, a perfectly mirrored sandbox environment displaying fabricated account balances. I watched the tense, heavy lines on Kendrick's face soften. A wide, arrogant smile stretched across his mouth. He let out a long, steady breath of pure relief. He saw exactly what he wanted to see. He saw a massive stockpile of cash sitting untouched and ready for withdrawal. He saw the illusion of absolute control. He locked his phone and slid it into his suit pocket, sitting up straight with renewed, arrogant confidence. "Good morning, Dad," he said, his voice dripping with fake affection as he took a sip of his black coffee. "You just rest today. Everything is completely under control. We have a big day tomorrow." I looked at him, my expression perfectly blank, offering a slow, trembling nod. "Yes, Kendrick," I whispered, my voice raspy and weak. "I am sure tomorrow will be a very big day." He stood up, adjusting his silk tie, and kissed Heather on the cheek before walking out the front door to his car. He swaggered to his vehicle, entirely convinced he was a criminal mastermind who had successfully secured his financial salvation. He had no idea he was a dead man walking into a trap of his own making. Friday morning arrived with an atmosphere so suffocatingly fake it made my stomach physically turn. I walked down the stairs, maintaining my slow, shuffling gait. The kitchen smelled of sizzling turkey bacon, fresh buttermilk pancakes, and expensive vanilla extract. Heather was standing by the stove, humming a cheerful melody. She was not dressed in her usual tight yoga gear today, but wore a conservative pastel dress that screamed supportive family member. Kendrick was standing by the marble island, adjusting the cuffs of his pristine navy blue tailored suit. His silk tie was perfectly knotted and his shoes were polished to a mirror shine. It was a sickening domestic tableau. They were celebrating the $4 million payday they thought was just hours away. "Good morning, Dad." Heather chimed, her voice dripping with an artificial sweetness that made my teeth ache. "I made your absolute favorite breakfast today. Eat up because you need your strength." They were feeding the condemned man his final meal. I sat down at the table, pulling my heavy robe around my shoulders. The sheer audacity of their performance was staggering. They were preparing to sell my entire life's work out from under me and lock me away, yet they smiled like angels. I picked up a piece of toasted sourdough bread with trembling hands, bringing it slowly to my mouth. I chewed deliberately, letting the heavy silence stretch across the kitchen. Kendrick poured himself a glass of orange juice, his movements stiff and overly controlled. I stared at him, my gaze cutting through the hazy facade of my supposed dementia. "Kendrick," I murmured, my voice low and raspy. "Do you remember that hot summer when you were 10 years old? You broke Mr. Henderson's front window with a baseball, and you hid in the basement for 6 hours because you were so terrified of the consequences." Kendrick paused, the glass of juice hovering just inches from his lips. He blinked, his confident facade cracking for a fraction of a second. "Yes, Dad," he answered slowly, his voice laced with sudden caution. "I remember that." I set my toast down and looked directly into his eyes. "I told you that day that the glass could easily be replaced." I said, my tone perfectly balanced between a nostalgic ramble and a sharp hidden warning. "I told you that the only thing a man truly owns in this world is his name and his word. A broken window is just an accident, but a lie is a deliberate choice that rots a man from the inside out." Do you remember what I taught you about honesty that day, Kendrick? A thick bead of sweat formed on Kendrick's forehead, glistening under the bright kitchen pendant lights. He swallowed hard, the Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He looked distinctly uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one polished shoe to the other. "Of course, Dad," he stammered, forcing a tight, unconvincing smile. "Honesty is the foundation of everything. I never forgot that important lesson." I nodded slowly, maintaining my vacant stare. "Good," I whispered, because today feels like a very important day for honesty. The air in the kitchen grew incredibly tense. Heather violently clattered a frying pan into the sink, trying to break the oppressive silence. "Eat your breakfast, Dad," she interrupted, her voice shrill and nervous. "We have a very busy morning ahead of us." Kendrick quickly recovered his composure, adjusting his silk tie with a clammy hand. "That is right, Dad," he said, adopting his fake, dutiful son persona once again. "We are taking you into the city today for a comprehensive medical checkup. Dr. Beaumont referred us to a top-tier specialist. They just want to run a few routine tests to make sure you are completely healthy and comfortable. It is all for your own good." I looked at the two of them, knowing perfectly well that the only appointment they had booked was with a ruthless commercial real estate developer waiting to steal my land. "Yes," I mumbled, returning my gaze to the half-eaten toast on my plate. "A medical checkup. I am ready to go whenever you are ready to take me." I watched Kendrick walk toward the hallway to grab his leather briefcase. From the outside, he looked like the absolute epitome of African-American success. He was a handsome, sharp, 35-year-old executive wearing a $3,000 bespoke suit and a luxury watch. He looked like a man who commanded boardrooms and built empires. But I knew the horrifying truth lurking beneath that expensive tailored wool. Inside, he was completely hollow. He was a terrified, desperate little boy, drowning in a $3 million ocean of illicit debt. The polished exterior was a desperate camouflage hiding a man who had received a gasoline-soaked dead rat on his desk just 24 hours ago. He was willing to forge federal documents, poison his own father, and sell his family legacy to avoid a violent execution in the streets. The contrast between his dignified outward appearance and his rotten, terrifying reality was repulsive. He had traded his soul and his heritage for a fake lifestyle that was currently collapsing around his throat. He thought this suit made him a king, but it was nothing more than high-priced armor for a coward. Heather grabbed my heavy winter coat and helped me put it on, treating me with the exaggerated gentleness one might use on a fragile porcelain doll. Kendrick held the front door open, checking his sleek watch for the 5th time in 10 minutes. We walked out into the crisp morning air. The sun was shining brightly, completely indifferent to the massive betrayal about to unfold. I shuffled toward Kendrick's luxury sports utility vehicle, leaning heavily on my wooden cane. Heather guided me into the spacious back seat, buckling my seatbelt as if I were incapable of performing the basic task myself. She climbed into the front passenger seat while Kendrick took the wheel, gripping the leather tightly. He started the engine and backed out of the driveway without a single backward glance at the house he was planning to demolish. The ride into the city was agonizingly quiet. Heather spent the entire trip aggressively applying makeup in the sun visor mirror, preparing her face for the massive financial windfall she believed was guaranteed. Kendrick kept his eyes locked dead ahead on the highway, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles pulsed visibly in his cheek. He navigated through the dense morning traffic, moving steadily toward the towering glass and steel skyline of the downtown financial district. I sat silently in the back, watching the city blocks pass by my mind, completely sharp and fully prepared for the upcoming slaughter. I knew exactly where we were going. We were not heading to a medical clinic or a hospital. Kendrick merged onto a busy commercial avenue and pulled the heavy vehicle into the underground parking garage of a massive 90-story corporate skyscraper. It was the central headquarters of the Carmichael Real Estate Development Group. Kendrick parked the car in a reserved spot near the private elevators. He let out a long, heavy exhale, killing the engine. "We are here, Dad," he said, forcing a cheerful tone that sounded completely hollow, echoing in the concrete garage. "The specialist office is right upstairs. Just stick close to us and everything will be perfectly fine." Heather opened my door and offered her hand, helping me step out onto the cold concrete floor. I leaned heavily on my cane, letting my shoulders droop. "I am right behind you, Kendrick," I whispered, my voice carrying a dark, unspoken promise. "I am not going anywhere." We stepped out of the private elevator onto the 90th floor. The entire level was a monument to corporate power and intimidation. Sleek marble floors stretched out toward a massive glass-enclosed boardroom that overlooked the sprawling city skyline. Inside that transparent box of greed sat the men who believed they were about to carve up my legacy. At the head of the long, polished mahogany table sat Richard Carmichael. He wore a custom-tailored suit that probably cost more than most people earned in a year. His predatory eyes tracked our arrival through the glass. Next to him sat Dr. Beaumont, still wearing his pristine white medical coat, a ridiculous costume chosen specifically to lend false medical authority to this illegal transaction. At the far end of the table, an independent commercial notary sat quietly organizing a stack of official state-stamped documents and adjusting his heavy brass seal. Heather, gripping my arm with aggressive force, guided me through the heavy glass doors. The air conditioning inside was turned down so low it felt like walking into a meat freezer. The stage was perfectly set for the ultimate betrayal. Kendrick directed me toward a plush leather armchair tucked away in the far corner of the expansive room, completely removed from the central mahogany table. "Sit here and rest, Dad," he said, his voice dripping with loud, theatrical sympathy, designed entirely for the audience in the room. "I will handle all the complicated paperwork for your treatments." I sank into the chair, letting my head loll slightly to the side, adopting my vacant, helpless stare. Heather handed me a glossy architectural magazine, patting my shoulder as if I were a toddler needing a distraction. "Read the pretty pictures, Dad," she murmured before rushing over to take her seat next to Kendrick. Kendrick opened his heavy leather briefcase with a sharp metallic click that echoed loudly in the quiet boardroom. He pulled out the master commercial land contract and laid it flat on the mahogany surface. Beside it, he placed the meticulously forged power of attorney and the fraudulent medical certificate of incompetence signed by Dr. Beaumont. "We have all the necessary documentation ready," Mr. Carmichael Kendrick announced, projecting the false confidence of a seasoned executive. "The deed transfer for the 3-acre commercial plot is fully prepared. As we discussed, the expedited cash purchase price is set at exactly $4 million. Carmichael leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood. He glanced over at me, sitting quietly in the corner, clutching the magazine with trembling hands. "It is a terrible tragedy seeing a strong man decline like that," Carmichael said, his tone entirely devoid of actual human empathy. "You are doing the right thing, Kendrick. Specialized memory care facilities are incredibly expensive. Liquidating his unused assets is the only responsible choice to ensure his comfort." Kendrick placed a hand over his heart, closing his eyes in a masterful display of fake grief. "It has been the hardest decision of my life, Richard." Kendrick lied seamlessly, his voice cracking with manufactured emotion, but his mind is completely gone. He barely knows what day it is. Sometimes he looks at me and does not even recognize his own son. I have to step up and make the difficult choices to protect him. Heather nodded solemnly, wiping a non-existent tear from her eye. "He needs 24-hour care immediately," she chimed in. "We are just so grateful your firm could expedite this cash transaction so we can secure his medical placement by this weekend." I sat in my corner, staring at the glossy pages of the magazine, listening to them weave a flawless narrative of familial devotion over my freshly dug grave. Kendrick slid the forged documents across the table toward the commercial notary, pointing to the signature line he had spent hours practicing in my home office. "I am the sole legal proxy," he stated firmly. "Let us finalize the transfer." Carmichael picked up the land contract and scanned the property coordinates. A deeply unsettling smile spread across his sharp features. The sheer naked greed radiating from him was palpable. He knew exactly what he was looking at. My 3 acres of land were positioned dead center in the most lucrative commercial development zone in the entire state. The true market value of that dirt was easily closer to $8 million. Carmichael knew he was robbing a desperate family blind, and he absolutely loved every single second of it. He ran his fingers over the thick paper, already calculating the massive skyscraper he would build on the foundation of my life's work. The fire sale price was a direct result of Kendrick's frantic panic to pay off the underground syndicate, and Carmichael was more than happy to feast on that bleeding desperation. "It is a fair price for a rapid close," Carmichael stated, smoothly adjusting his expensive silk tie. "My holding company has the full $4 million in liquid funds ready to wire the exact second the notary stamps this contract. We can have your father settled into a facility by tonight." Carmichael reached inside his tailored jacket and retrieved a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen. He uncapped it with a smooth, deliberate motion, resting the nib just millimeters above the signature line of the $4 million contract. He looked across the table at the corrupt medical professional, seeking final reassurance before committing the massive funds. "Is the medical proxy absolutely ironclad?" Dr. Beaumont Carmichael asked, his predatory eyes narrowing. "I do not want any legal complications from the state probate courts down the line. I need absolute certainty that the old man cannot contest this transfer." Dr. Beaumont sat up straight, adjusting his pristine white coat with arrogant confidence. He looked over at me, sitting silently in my corner armchair. My professional medical diagnosis is indisputable, Dr. Beaumont declared, his voice ringing with fraudulent authority. Mr. Sylvester is suffering from profound, irreversible cognitive failure. He lacks all necessary mental capacity to understand or execute basic legal decisions. The power of attorney held by his son is legally absolute. You have my full medical guarantee, Mr. Carmichael. Carmichael smiled, gripping the gold pen tightly. Excellent, he murmured, lowering his hand to sign the master deed. He never finished the first letter. The thick glass doors of the executive boardroom did not just open. They were shoved apart with such sudden violent force that the heavy brass handles slammed aggressively against the reinforced glass walls. The sharp, echoing crash caused everyone at the mahogany table to flinch and jump in their seats. Carmichael dropped his gold pen. Kendrick spun around his face, instantly draining of blood. Heather let out a short, high-pitched gasp of shock. Standing in the doorway blocking the only exit was my financial attorney, Garrett. He wore a razor-sharp black suit and held a massive leather briefcase, gripping it like a loaded weapon. Standing right beside him, radiating the quiet, terrifying menace of an apex predator, was DeAndre, the private investigator. DeAndre crossed his thick, muscular arms over his chest, his eyes locking directly onto Kendrick with a cold, unblinking stare. Kendrick leaped out of his chair, his voice cracking in sheer panic. "Who are you people?" he shouted, pointing a trembling finger toward the door. "This is a highly confidential private meeting." Garrett stepped fully into the boardroom, his polished leather shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor. "I would strongly advise against calling security," Kendrick Garrett announced, his voice booming with absolute unyielding authority. "Because the men waiting down in the lobby are not building security. They are federal agents, and they are extremely eager to hear all about this transaction." I tossed the glossy architectural magazine onto the plush carpet. The heavy thud drew the eyes of everyone in the room. I placed my wooden cane against the armrest and pushed myself up from the leather chair. There was no hesitation in my joints, no trembling in my hands, and absolutely no fog in my eyes. I rolled my shoulders back, expanding my chest and rising to my full towering height. The pathetic, shuffling old man vanished into thin air, replaced entirely by the master engineer who had built his life from concrete and steel. I walked slowly toward the center of the boardroom. My footsteps were heavy, deliberate, and echoing with absolute authority. Kendrick stared at me as if I had just risen from the dead. His jaw went slack. Heather shrank back in her chair, her eyes wide with sudden, unfiltered terror, gripping the edge of the mahogany table until her knuckles turned white. They had spent 6 months treating me like a dying animal, and now the predator had finally bared its teeth. I did not look at my treacherous family right away. I locked my eyes directly onto the greedy real estate developer sitting at the head of the table. "If you let that gold pen touch that signature line, Mr. Carmichael," I said, my voice booming across the polished mahogany table with crystal clear articulation, "you will be committing a $4 million federal wire fraud." Carmichael froze his hand, hovering in midair. He looked from me to Kendrick and back to Garrett, his predatory confidence instantly evaporating. "What is the exact meaning of this?" Carmichael demanded, his voice rising in sudden panic. "Who is this man? And why is he interrupting a closed corporate transaction?" Garrett stepped forward, slapping his massive leather briefcase onto the pristine glass surface of the boardroom table. He clicked the brass locks open and pulled out a thick stack of state-certified documents, stamped with the official red seal of the probate court. "That man is Sylvester Garrett," declared, pointing a sharp finger at me. "He is my client, and he is completely in possession of his mental faculties. Furthermore, the documents sitting on your table right now are entirely fraudulent." Garrett picked up the land contract Kendrick had presented and tossed it back at Carmichael. "As of midnight last night, my client executed an irrevocable blind trust. He legally transferred the master deed of his 3-acre commercial plot, his residential home, and every single liquid asset he possessed into that highly secured trust. I am the sole designated executor. In the eyes of the law, Sylvester currently owns absolutely nothing. Therefore, he cannot sell you anything today." Carmichael turned a furious crimson shade. He glared at Kendrick, whose breathing had become rapid and shallow. "You told me you had the absolute legal authority to execute this sale," Carmichael roared. "You showed me the power of attorney." Garrett let out a sharp, humorless laugh. He picked up Kendrick's meticulously forged document and held it up to the fluorescent light. A power of attorney only grants proxy control over assets that the principal actually owns, Garrett explained, his voice dripping with legal contempt. Since Sylvester owns no property as of this morning, this piece of paper is completely worthless. Even if it were a legitimate document, it could not authorize the sale of a single blade of grass on that property. But the reality is far worse for you, Kendrick. We have 3 hours of high-definition surveillance video showing you sitting at your father's desk, practicing his signature on tracing vellum to forge this exact document. You are attempting to sell a multi-million-dollar property that belongs to a secure legal trust using a highly documented forgery. If Mr. Carmichael wires those funds to your account, he becomes a direct accessory to a massive federal crime. Carmichael dropped his gold pen as if it were burning hot iron. He pushed his chair back violently, putting as much physical distance between himself and the fraudulent contract as possible. He realized instantly how close he had come to destroying his entire corporate empire. Kendrick completely collapsed. The polished, arrogant executive facade shattered into a million irreparable pieces. All the color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a pale, sickly ghost. He stumbled backward away from the mahogany table, his legs giving out. He hit the edge of a heavy glass credenza and leaned against it for support, gasping for air. His tailored navy suit suddenly looked like a cheap, oversized costume. The reality of the situation crushed him with the weight of a freight train. The $4 million he desperately needed to save his life from the underground lending syndicate was gone. The commercial land he thought he controlled belonged to a blind trust he could not touch. The forged power of attorney he had staked his entire future on was now the exact piece of evidence that would send him to a federal penitentiary for decades. The image of the gasoline-soaked rat flashed in his mind. He looked at the fake documents, then up at my face, his eyes darting frantically around the room, looking for an exit that did not exist. He tried to speak, but his throat just seized up. He stammered, producing only pathetic broken syllables, utterly paralyzed by his own monumental failure. The only person in the room arrogant enough to still fight back was Dr. Beaumont. The corrupt physician stood up, puffing out his chest, adjusting his pristine white lab coat in a desperate attempt to reclaim his shattered authority. "This is an absolute outrage, Doctor," Beaumont shouted, his face flushing with indignant rage. "I am a licensed medical professional with decades of highly respected clinical experience. I conducted a thorough cognitive examination of this patient just days ago. He is suffering from advanced dementia. His current state of apparent lucidity is nothing more than a temporary neurological surge common in degenerative brain diseases. My medical certificate is entirely legally binding and factually accurate. I will not stand here and have my professional reputation dragged through the mud by some aggressive attorney. I will sue you and your client for severe defamation." I did not raise my voice to argue with his pathetic lies. I simply turned my head and gave DeAndre a single sharp nod. The former detective did not say a word. He calmly pulled a digital tablet from his jacket pocket and walked over to the massive digital media screen mounted on the boardroom wall. He plugged a secure data cable directly into the primary display port. Within 2 seconds, the corporate presentation screen flickered and switched inputs. The entire room went dead silent as a crystal-clear high-definition video began to play. It was the hidden camera footage from my kitchen. On the massive 80-inch screen, everyone in the room watched Dr. Beaumont standing by my marble island. The audio was flawless. The speakers blasted Kendrick's desperate voice, stating exactly why he needed the fake medical certificate to bypass the probate courts. Then the screen showed Kendrick pulling the thick manila envelope bulging with $20,000 in untraceable cash from his tailored jacket and shoving it directly into Beaumont's eager hands. The doctor's own voice echoed through the freezing boardroom, assuring Kendrick that the fake dementia diagnosis would hold up in any family court. Dr. Beaumont stopped breathing. His indignant rage vanished instantly, replaced by the terrifying realization that his entire career and his freedom were permanently over. He stared at the giant screen, watching himself commit a blatant felony in high definition. The arrogant physician sank slowly back into his leather chair, covering his mouth with a trembling hand, completely destroyed by the undeniable digital proof of his own overwhelming greed. The crushing silence in the boardroom was only broken by Dr. Beaumont's heavy, ragged breathing. But I was not finished. The medical fraud was merely the beginning of their comprehensive destruction. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit coat and pulled out the sealed toxicology report from Dr. Eris's private clinic. I walked directly over to Heather, who was shaking violently in her chair, trying to make herself as small as possible. I slammed the thick stack of certified medical papers down onto the glass table right in front of her. The sharp smack echoed like a gunshot. Every single night you handed me that bitter herbal tea with a fake plastic smile on your face, I stated, my voice radiating a dark, lethal calm. You told me it was for my cellular health. But these certified laboratory results paint a very different picture. Massive toxic levels of thallium heavy metals and potent psychiatric sedatives. You were not just trying to make me forget my own name, Heather. You were systematically poisoning my internal organs. You were actively committing premeditated attempted murder under my own roof. Heather recoiled as if the paper itself were covered in acid, her eyes wide with undeniable guilt. Before Heather could even attempt to formulate a pathetic lying defense, I signaled DeAndre again. The former detective stepped forward and handed me a thick, bulging manila envelope. I did not just place the contents on the table. I tore the envelope open and violently scattered the glossy photographs and official financial receipts across the mahogany surface, letting them rain down like a devastating storm of undeniable truth. You played the pious, holistic wife so perfectly to your internet followers, I declared, my voice dripping with absolute disgust. But behind closed doors, you are nothing more than a greedy, ruthless parasite. I pointed to the high-resolution photographs scattered near Kendrick's trembling hands. The crisp images clearly showed Heather walking into the upscale downtown boutique hotel, clinging tightly to the heavily muscled arm of Bryce, the personal trainer. The next series of photos captured them kissing passionately in the hotel lobby, completely unashamed of their illicit affair. While my son was sweating in my basement trying to forge documents to save his own life from violent criminals, you were spending his stolen money to finance your secret romantic getaway with a gym instructor, I announced, making sure every single word cut incredibly deep. I reached into the messy pile and pulled out a crisp printed document, sliding it directly toward Kendrick. Look closely at this dealership invoice, Kendrick, I commanded. The exact same day the bank disbursed the $500,000 fraudulent bridge loan into your joint account, your loving wife initiated an immediate external wire transfer. She pulled exactly $50,000 of your highly illegal loan money and used it as a massive cash down payment on a brand new luxury convertible sports car. And she registered the vehicle exclusively in Bryce's name. Heather covered her face with her hands, letting out a high-pitched whimper of absolute defeat, but I was completely relentless. I dropped the final piece of evidence directly on top of the luxury car invoice. It was the printed receipt from the greasy cash for gold pawn shop on the east side of town, bearing Heather's exact signature. When the loan money was not enough to fund her illicit lifestyle, she decided to pry open the hidden floor panel in my bedroom closet. I continued, my voice hardening to pure steel. She stole my late wife Corinne's sacred antique jewelry. She fenced a lifetime of invaluable family heirlooms for pennies on the dollar to buy expensive designer gifts for another man. She signed her own name on the theft receipt, fully certifying she was the lawful owner. The sheer volume of the physical evidence covering the table was absolutely suffocating. Every single lie, every stolen dollar, and every hidden sin was completely exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the corporate boardroom, leaving her absolutely no room to escape the brutal reality of her actions. She was a thief, a liar, and a completely manipulative fraud. Kendrick stared down at the glossy photographs of his wife locking lips with another man. His eyes darted to the luxury car invoice and then to the damning pawn shop receipt. The realization of his absolute monumental humiliation washed over him in sickening, heavy waves. He had risked decades in a federal penitentiary. He had poisoned his own father and attempted to sell his entire family legacy. He had lived in pure daily terror of violent loan sharks, all to secure a financial future for a woman who was actively sleeping with another man and bleeding his stolen funds dry. He was not a masterful criminal architect. He was a pathetic, gullible pawn. He had been brutally cuckolded and financially manipulated by the very woman he thought was his devoted partner in crime. The sharp, tailored suit he wore suddenly felt like a heavy, suffocating straitjacket. Kendrick's hands began to shake violently, not from fear of the syndicate, but from the crushing weight of his own profound stupidity. He looked at Heather with an expression of pure, unadulterated hatred, his chest heaving aggressively as he gasped for air, struggling to process the monumental betrayal. The fragile, toxic alliance between my son and his wife instantly disintegrated into absolute chaos. Kendrick lunged forward, slamming his fists heavily onto the glass table. You stole the bridge loan money, he screamed, his voice cracking with raw, visceral fury. I forged those federal documents to save my actual life from a deadly cartel, and you gave $50,000 to a random guy at the gym. You set me up to be murdered. Heather dropped her hands from her face, her fear instantly mutating into vicious defensive rage. Do not you dare act like a victim, Kendrick! She shrieked, pointing a shaking manicured finger right back at his face. You are a complete failure. You lost your entire logistics company playing stupid digital currency games. You dragged me into $3 million of underworld debt. I had to secure my own future because you are a pathetic, weak man who could not even properly execute a simple staircase accident. You told me to increase the heavy metal poison, Kendrick roared back, the veins in his neck bulging aggressively. You told me to push him down the stairs. This was your entire master plan. I should have never listened to a fake internet fraud like you. They screamed at each other, their voices echoing loudly off the thick glass walls of the boardroom, violently tearing each other apart, while the undeniable evidence of their mutual destruction sat scattered between them. Carmichael backed further into the corner of the room, looking absolutely horrified by the vicious domestic slaughter unfolding in his pristine corporate office. Doctor. Beaumont remained frozen in his chair, staring blankly at the wall, completely paralyzed by the realization of his ruined career. I stood silently watching the monsters I had harbored under my roof consume themselves. Right at the absolute peak of their screaming match, a sound pierced through the heavy reinforced glass of the 90th floor windows. It started as a faint, distant wail, but quickly grew into a sharp, piercing mechanical howl. The distinct blaring sirens of multiple police cruisers tore through the downtown morning air. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the surrounding glass skyscrapers, signaling the arrival of inevitable justice. The wailing sound echoed violently from the ground floor lobby, rushing up the elevator shafts like a tidal wave. Kendrick and Heather froze instantly, their furious screams dying in their throats. They slowly turned their heads toward the massive glass doors of the boardroom, the blood draining completely from their terrified faces. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open with commanding force. Half a dozen federal agents and armed local police officers flooded the room. Their heavy tactical boots thudded against the polished marble floor, drowning out the last fading echoes of the sirens outside. "Nobody move," the lead agent ordered, his voice echoing with absolute authority. He pointed directly at Kendrick and Heather. The officers moved with swift, practiced precision. Two agents grabbed Kendrick, spinning him around and slamming him face first against the glass wall. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists sounded like the ultimate finality. Heather shrieked as an officer grabbed her arms, pulling them forcefully behind her back. She struggled wildly, kicking her designer heels against the carpet, but she was quickly subdued and tightly cuffed. Dr. Beaumont stood frozen, his pristine white coat practically glowing under the harsh fluorescent lights. An officer approached him, securing his hands behind his back and reading him his rights in a loud, clear tone. "You are under arrest for medical fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder," the agent declared. The arrogant physician said absolutely nothing, his eyes fixed to the floor in pure shame. Kendrick was breathing heavily, his face pressed against the cold glass. The officers pulled him back, securing his arms, but he fought against their grip. He turned his head, looking at me with wild, bloodshot eyes. The arrogant executive facade was completely gone, replaced by the raw, primal terror of a cornered animal. "Dad," he screamed, his voice cracking with sheer desperation. "Dad, you have to stop this. You have to tell them to let me go." He aggressively twisted his body, throwing himself onto his knees right in front of me. He managed to wrap his cuffed hands around my suit trousers, clinging to the fabric like a drowning man holding onto a life preserver. "Please, Dad," he sobbed openly, thick, heavy tears streaming down his face. "You do not understand what is happening. The underground syndicate is not going to wait for me to go to prison. They have people everywhere. If I go behind bars with a $3 million debt, they will have me murdered in my cell before the week is over. They will cut my throat, Dad. You have to give me the land. You have to save my life. We are family. You are my father." The entire room went dead silent. Even the federal agents paused, waiting to see how I would react to a son begging for his very life. I looked down at Kendrick. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I did not feel the protective instinct of a father. I felt absolutely nothing. The man kneeling on the floor crying and begging was the exact same man who had steadily poured poison into my tea every single night. He was the man who had deliberately loosened the screws on my staircase, hoping I would fall and break my neck. I slowly reached down and firmly pried his trembling fingers off my trousers. I took a deliberate step backward, severing any physical connection between us. The family died the exact night I lay awake and listened to you plan my murder through the air conditioning vent. I stated, my voice resonating with cold, unforgiving finality. I spent my entire life building a legacy to protect you. I broke my back working double shifts, and your mother scrubbed floors until her knees bled to give you the world. And you traded every drop of our sweat for a fake lifestyle and a mountain of criminal debt. You are not a son begging for his father. You are a predator begging for his prey. Kendrick let out a gut-wrenching wail, rocking back and forth on his knees. Please, Dad, I am sorry. I was desperate. I will do anything. You cannot just let them kill me. You are a businessman, Kendrick, I replied, my tone completely devoid of mercy. You understand how ledgers work. You took a massive risk and you lost absolutely everything. I owe you nothing. In my eyes, you are no longer my flesh and blood. You are simply a very bad investment that I am permanently writing off. The sheer absolute coldness of my rejection hit him harder than the steel handcuffs. His eyes went wide, and the last remaining shred of hope completely vanished from his face. He slumped forward, resting his forehead against the carpet, entirely defeated by his own monumental failure. The lead agent signaled to his officers with a sharp nod. Get them out of here, he commanded. The officers hauled Kendrick to his feet, dragging him roughly toward the boardroom doors. He did not fight back anymore. His legs were like jelly, his spirit utterly broken by my final words. Heather was sobbing hysterically as they led her away, her makeup running in dark streaks down her face. She looked back at me one last time, her eyes full of venom and fear, but I simply turned my head, refusing to give her a single second of acknowledgement. Dr. Beaumont walked out with his head bowed, completely silent, accepting the ruin of his entire professional life. I stood perfectly still in the center of the vast corporate boardroom, watching the three of them being escorted into the hallway. The heavy glass doors swung shut behind them, muffling the sounds of their pathetic cries and the sharp commands of the federal agents. A profound quiet settled over the room. The toxic energy that had suffocated me for 6 long months was finally gone. I took a deep, steady breath, inhaling the cold, air-conditioned breeze, feeling an immense physical weight lift from my shoulders. The poison was officially removed from my life. The only external sound left in the room was the frantic rustling of thick paper. I slowly turned my gaze toward the head of the mahogany table. Richard Carmichael was in an absolute state of panic. The arrogant, predatory developer who had been eager to feast on my desperate family just 10 minutes ago was now violently shoving his documents into his expensive leather briefcase. His hands were shaking so badly he dropped his gold-plated fountain pen twice before finally managing to scoop it up from the floor. He zipped the briefcase shut and looked up at me, his face pale and glistening with cold sweat. Mr. Sylvester Carmichael stammered, his voice completely stripped of its usual corporate bravado. I want to sincerely apologize for this entire misunderstanding. I had absolutely no idea about the criminal nature of these proceedings. My firm operates strictly within the boundaries of the law. If I had known those medical certificates were fraudulent or that the power of attorney was forged, I would have immediately contacted the authorities myself. We are victims in this situation as well. Garrett stepped forward, crossing his arms over his chest and shooting Carmichael a look of pure legal contempt. Save the public relations speech for the federal investigators, Carmichael, Garrett said sharply. We all know you love a distressed fire sale. You saw a vulnerable family and tried to exploit them for a massive discount. You are incredibly lucky my client established the blind trust last night. If you had wired a single dollar into that fraudulent account, your entire holding company would be facing federal asset forfeiture right now. Carmichael swallowed hard, unable to meet Garrett's intense gaze. He nodded frantically, grabbing his briefcase tightly against his chest. Yes, of course, he mumbled, stepping quickly away from the table. I will make my legal team fully available to assist your investigation in any way necessary. Please accept my deepest apologies again. He did not wait for a response. He practically ran toward the glass doors, shoving them open and fleeing down the hallway, desperate to distance himself from the toxic fallout of the morning. The independent commercial notary had silently slipped out during the chaos, leaving his official stamp sitting abandoned on the table. The massive executive boardroom was finally empty. It was just me standing tall and resolute alongside my trusted attorney and the brilliant private investigator. Garrett looked at me, a fierce, triumphant smile spreading across his face. DeAndre nodded in silent, profound respect. We had faced the absolute worst of human greed, and we had crushed it completely. The fortress was secure. Exactly 1 month had passed since the massive glass doors of the Carmichael corporate boardroom swung shut on my son and his deceitful wife. I was sitting at my heavy mahogany desk, the very same desk where Kendrick had desperately spent hours forging my signature on federal bank documents. The morning sun streamed through the large window, casting a warm, golden light across the polished wood. The house was entirely silent, but it was a completely different kind of silence now. It was not the heavy, suffocating quiet of a hostage, waiting for his daily poison to be served in a ceramic mug. It was the deep, profound peace of a man who had successfully reclaimed his entire kingdom. Resting perfectly centered on my desk was a thick, black manila folder. It was the final comprehensive investigative report from DeAndre. I poured myself a steaming cup of strong black coffee, taking a moment to appreciate the rich, bold aroma without the bitter, metallic taint of heavy metals. I sat down in my leather chair, opened the heavy folder, and began to read the detailed official conclusion of the absolute destruction they had brought upon themselves. The justice system moved with an aggressive, terrifying speed when dealing with highly documented federal wire fraud and premeditated attempted murder. The digital and physical evidence we had handed over to the federal prosecutors was so overwhelmingly conclusive that neither Kendrick nor Heather even attempted to take their cases to trial. Their expensive defense attorneys took one single look at the high-definition surveillance videos, the forged commercial loan documents, and the certified toxicology reports before immediately advising them to accept full plea deals. Heather was completely stripped of her fake holistic wellness empire. The digital influencers and corporate sponsors who had blindly funded her lifestyle abandoned her the exact second the attempted murder charges went public. Her social media accounts were permanently deleted, erasing her entire fraudulent identity from the internet. The federal judge showed absolutely zero leniency for a woman who systematically poisoned an elderly man under the guise of family care. She was sentenced to 15 solid years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. But her ultimate humiliation did not end in the courtroom. According to DeAndre's detailed follow-up report, the moment the police raided my house to secure her belongings, her secret lover Bryce completely vanished. He packed his expensive designer clothes into the luxury convertible sports car Heather had bought him with my stolen loan money and drove straight out of state. He left no forwarding address and immediately disconnected his phone. Heather traded her freedom to fund a man who did not even bother to visit her in the county holding cell. Kendrick faced an even darker, more terrifying reality. He was officially sentenced to 20 years in federal prison for massive bank fraud, identity theft, and criminal conspiracy. Dr. Beaumont lost his medical license permanently and received 10 years for his corrupt participation, leaving him a disgraced and broken man. But the cold, sterile walls of his federal cell offered Kendrick absolutely no protection from the massive debt he had accumulated. The underground lending syndicate did not simply forgive his $3 million default. The exact day Kendrick was officially incarcerated, the ruthless enforcers aggressively seized his luxury downtown apartment, liquidating every single piece of expensive furniture, designer clothing, and high-end electronics he owned to partially satisfy the heavy interest. DeAndre's internal prison contacts reported that the syndicate had already reached out to their affiliated inmates inside Kendrick's specific federal facility. My son was currently living in a state of absolute psychological and physical terror. He was locked inside a concrete cage surrounded by violent men who held the contract on his life. He spent every single minute of his day constantly looking over his shoulder, terrified of the shadows jumping at every sudden noise in the cell block. He wanted to play the high-stakes game of a ruthless corporate shark, but he ended up as nothing more than a pathetic, frightened target trapped in a nightmare from which he would never wake up. I read the sterile typed words detailing their absolute ruin, and I felt absolutely no sorrow. Society often dictates that a father should possess a bottomless well of unconditional forgiveness for his child regardless of the sins committed. But unconditional love is a sacred bond reserved for those who actually possess a human soul. When a person looks you directly in the eyes, smiles warmly, and intentionally feeds you a lethal dose of heavy metals, they instantly forfeit their right to any familial grace. Their brutal punishment was not an act of my personal vengeance. It was the undeniable, inevitable law of karma executing its flawless design. They had built a fragile house of cards on a foundation of pure, unadulterated greed, deceit, and horrific violence. I merely opened the front door and let the heavy wind blow it all completely down. There was absolutely no room left in my heart for pity. The man who would have gladly laid down his life to protect his only son died the exact moment I heard them plotting my execution through the cold brass vent. The man sitting at the desk today was simply a survivor. I closed the thick black folder and pushed it to the corner of my desk. The war was officially over, and it was time to settle the accounts with the men who had stood faithfully by my side on the battlefield. I opened my heavy leather checkbook drawing directly from the secure operational funds maintained by the Irrevocable Blind Trust. I wrote out a massive, generous check to Garrett for his flawless legal execution and his unwavering friendship. I wrote a second, equally substantial check to DeAndre for his masterful surveillance work and his absolute discretion. They were top-tier professionals who had delivered exactly what they promised, and I ensured they were compensated far beyond their standard billing rates. I sealed the checks in crisp white envelopes ready to be hand-delivered by courier that very afternoon. With the administrative tasks firmly concluded, I picked up my phone and began dialing the numbers of the best local contractors in the city. The house was finally legally and physically mine again, but it still carried the lingering foul stench of their deceitful presence. I hired a premium commercial cleaning crew, instructing them to aggressively scrub every single square inch of the second floor. I ordered them to strip the expensive designer bedding, throw the custom mattress directly into the dumpster, and chemically sanitize the master bathroom from top to bottom. I wanted every single trace of Heather's sickening floral perfume and Kendrick's expensive cologne completely eradicated from the very drywall. I hired professional painters to prime and repaint the guest rooms, stripping away the horrible modern colors they had chosen and returning the walls to the warm, comforting tones Corinne had always loved. I called a professional hauling service and told them to back a heavy industrial dumpster right up to the driveway. They were instructed to haul away every piece of clothing, every piece of fake holistic equipment, and every shred of paper Kendrick and Heather had left behind. I was not going to pack their belongings into neat cardboard boxes for storage. I was throwing their entire toxic history straight into the local landfill where it belonged. I walked out of the office and stood in the grand marble foyer looking up at the heavy oak staircase I had once smoothed with my own bleeding hands. The heavy steel lag bolts Marcus had installed remained firmly in place, a permanent structural reminder of the day this house fought back and won. I took a deep breath of the fresh morning air filling my lungs completely. The grueling cleansing process had officially begun. A few months later, the transformation of my home was finally complete. I stepped out onto the wide wooden porch I had built with my own two hands, just as the morning sun began to crest over the horizon. The air was crisp and incredibly clean, carrying the faint, sweet scent of the blooming magnolias from the front yard. I held a large ceramic mug in my right hand, feeling the comforting heat radiate against my palm. Inside was not the bitter, metallic-tasting herbal tea that had nearly stolen my life and my mind. It was pure, strong black coffee brewed exactly the way Corinne and I used to drink it every single morning before the world woke up. The toxic clouds that had hovered over this property were permanently gone. The heavy, oppressive energy brought in by Kendrick and his deceitful wife had been completely scrubbed from the walls, the floors, and the very air I breathed. I took a long, deep sip of the coffee, letting the rich, bold flavor wash over my tongue. I stood perfectly still, listening to the morning birds sing, feeling the strong, steady beat of my own healthy heart. I was alive, my mind was entirely my own, and my fortress was completely secure. With my personal sanctuary fully restored, I turned my sharp focus towards securing the true legacy of this family. Kendrick had proven himself completely unworthy of the wealth Corinne and I had broken our backs to build. He had viewed our life savings as nothing more than a convenient slush fund to cover his arrogant, catastrophic failures. But that money still held immense power, and I was determined to see it used for genuine good. I scheduled a long meeting with Garrett at his downtown law firm. Together, we drafted the official charter for the Corinne Memorial Engineering Scholarship. We allocated a massive portion of the liquid assets safely guarded inside the Irrevocable Blind Trust to permanently endow the foundation. We did not set up a charity for privileged kids looking for an easy ride. This specific fund was strictly designed to provide full-ride tuition and generous living stipends to brilliant-driven African-American students from working-class backgrounds. I wanted to find the young men and women who understood the absolute value of a calloused hand and a late-night study session. I wanted to support the students who would look at a set of complicated blueprints and see a bright future they could build with their own relentless determination. Yesterday, I had the profound honor of meeting the very first recipient of Corinne's scholarship. His name was Malik. He was a highly focused 20-year-old who had been working 2 grueling part-time jobs just to afford his community college textbooks. He sat in my living room wearing a modest but perfectly ironed suit, holding his acceptance letter to the State University engineering program. His eyes shone with a mixture of deep gratitude and fierce ambition. When I shook his hand, I felt the rough texture of a young man who was not afraid of hard manual labor. I saw the exact same fire and absolute integrity in his eyes that I used to see in the mirror 40 years ago. As I watched Malik walk down my driveway, heading toward a future he would build with his own brilliant mind, I felt a powerful wave of emotion. Corinne's relentless sacrifices, scrubbing floors and working late hours were not wasted on the ungrateful son currently sitting in a federal prison cell. Her beautiful legacy was now actively funding the bright, promising futures of an entire generation of builders and innovators. We were lifting up our community instead of letting one greedy individual tear our history down to the ground. People often ask me if I feel lonely living in this massive house all by myself. Neighbors look at me with pity, assuming an elderly widower without his children must be suffering in silent isolation. They could not be more wrong. The profound, absolute serenity I feel right now is the greatest luxury I have ever known. I have come to realize a very harsh but liberating truth about life. Voluntary solitude is 1,000,000 times more powerful than a house full of fake affection. I would rather eat a simple meal in total silence than sit at a crowded dining table surrounded by parasites eagerly waiting for me to die. There is no more walking on eggshells in my own hallways. There are no more condescending remarks about my age or my memory from people trying to manipulate my reality. There are no more hidden agendas or toxic cups of tea served with a deceitful plastic smile. The quiet in my home is not empty or sad. It is completely full of peace, security, and the comforting memories of the beautiful, authentic life I shared with my true love. In my 40 years as a civil engineer, I learned a fundamental rule about structural integrity and the raw forces of nature. Sometimes you plant a seed in good soil. You water it, you nurture it, and you give it every possible advantage to grow tall and strong. But despite your absolute best efforts, the tree grows crooked. A dark disease settles deep into its core, rotting the wood from the inside out. When you realize the tree is fundamentally diseased, you cannot simply paint the bark and hope it magically gets better. You cannot just trim a few dead branches and pretend the rot will not eventually spread to the roots and poison the entire garden. There is only one responsible course of action for a master builder. You have to take a sharp, heavy axe and cut that diseased tree down to the very stump. You have to remove it completely to protect the healthy soil and the remaining life around it. Kendrick was that rotten tree. I gave him the strongest foundation a father could possibly provide, but he actively chose to let greed, arrogance, and violence poison his soul. When I realized he was plotting to crush me under the weight of his own toxic decisions, I did not hesitate or wait for a miracle. I swung the axe. I cut the financial ties, the legal vulnerabilities, and the familial bonds completely and permanently. It was a brutal, agonizing swing, but it ultimately saved my life. I am Sylvester. I am 69 years old, and I am the sole master of my own fate. I survived the ultimate betrayal by utilizing the very intellect and discipline my enemies thought they could easily drug away. I protected my sacred sanctuary. I secured my late wife's beautiful legacy, and I permanently eliminated the deadly threats hiding in my own hallways. I did not just survive their manufactured storm. I became the storm, and I washed the filth completely clean from my doorstep. Finally, after all the chaos and the deceit, I have successfully cleared the dead weight from my property. My garden is clean, my fortress is absolutely secure, and I am standing taller than ever before. If there is one final lesson I want to impart, it is this: never confuse silence with ignorance, and never mistake old age for weakness. The world teaches us to dismiss the elderly as fragile burdens waiting to be managed by the next generation. But the gray hair on my head was not earned through weakness. It was forged through decades of survival hard work and quiet, meticulous observation. Youth relies on loud arrogance and reckless speed, but true power lies in absolute patience. I let my enemies mistake my quiet demeanor for a fading mind, and that fatal miscalculation became their ultimate downfall. If this story resonated with you today, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below so we can keep building this community of strength together.